Good morning, everyone. Or shall I say good afternoon to some of you. I'm in New York, so it is 12:30 on the dot. So I'd like to welcome you to AFTO's Advanced Inspector Bootcamp, the second series that began last week. And I'm sure that many of you have returned from last week. I think there are over 700 registrants today, which is a wonderful number. We had approximately the same last week, so I'm assuming that many of you are repeat attendees, which is a great thing. So I'd like to introduce myself to you. My name is Angela Montalbano. I am currently the president for the Association of Food and Drug Officials, and I work for New York State. I'm the assistant director for food safety, and I just want to take this opportunity to welcome you to today's session. So before we do get started, I would like to go over a few housekeeping reminders for you. And one of them is to ensure that you know that you have every opportunity to engage with the presenters today. In fact, we hope you do, and I'm sure the presenters do as well, but you do have many opportunities to share your thoughts, your questions, and comments. I do hope that you utilize the question and answer section in the bottom section of the Zoom platform. I'm assuming that many of you, since you are repeat registrants, I'm assuming that you're well aware of the system that we have in place here. But please do put your questions in and answers into that question and answer box. And then also there's a chat box option. And if you toggle on where the little arrow is, you can see that there are the panelists and presenters, and then there's everyone. So please take the opportunity to meet some other people that are on the line. I know this is a virtual setting. I know it's a little challenging, but we'd never be able to get 700 people in a room together. But it is a great opportunity for you to network with others from across the country. As you do look in the chat box, I can see there are people from all over the place. We have Texas and Maryland and Missouri. So it's really cool, a great opportunity for you to meet people. Like I said, I've been an AFTO member for it has to be over 20 years now. And I shared in the first time, and maybe you heard me say this, but this AFTO is an amazing place where you can meet and network with food safety professionals across the country. And not only will you have, meet colleagues, but you'll also make some lifelong friends. So I do hope you take the opportunity today to engage with others that are on this call with you. Also, you can see on the screen there are two people, Christina Heist and Autumn Shook, and their email addresses are on there. But I think we'll pop into the chat their phone numbers just in case you have any kind of a problem. And in case you have any technical difficulties, you can give them a call. So there you go. Autumn is putting it in the chat now. So please take note of Autumn's name and her phone number, just in case you have any kind of an issue during the session. And also be aware that this is a safe forum for you to engage with the presenters and any of the attendees. Please be mindful, be respectful of others, but also, again, this is a safe environment, and you should really feel comfortable that if you have any questions or concerns, just pop them in those boxes so we can help you move along. Okay, the next slide is a polling slide. So we do want to know who's in attendance today, and that is for the purpose of the speakers, so they can have an idea as to who they're giving their presentations to. And also it gives us an idea as to who's attending the sessions. And in addition, it helps us check that the poll system is actually working. So as you'll see, the first one, the question is asking who's in attendance today, state, local, federal, tribal, territorial, or other. And then the second question is, how long have you been an inspector? It's from 0 to 2 to 10 plus. And the 10 plus is, really what this group is for. This is the advanced boot camp. Yesterday, we had one for the basic, which is typically for the 0 to 2 years of experience. But we'll give you an opportunity to answer these questions, and then we will show you the results. And then we'll actually know who's on the line with us today. And here we go. Very similar to last week. There's 67% local, 32% state, 1% federal, which is exactly what we had last week. We didn't have any tribal territorial last week either, which is unfortunate, and hoping that we can get the word and encourage tribal and territorial colleagues of ours to join us on the next sessions, or even so they know that these opportunities are out there for them. We did have an other last week, and I never really found out what the other was. I don't know if anyone on the call, I'm sorry, I'm dealing with a cold. It's cold in New York, and I have a cold. So I didn't know who the other was last week, but if we find out, that would be a little interesting to know what the other was. And then now we have 0 to 2 years, 7%, and 2 to 5, we have 31%. So this way, our speakers do have an opportunity to know exactly who we are engaging with today. Thank you for sharing the polls. And next slide will be the agenda. And you can see we have Frank Yanis going to talk to us about food safety culture. I will tell you, I know Frank just gave a class last week. I was not there. However, I took the course the year before, and it was an absolute phenomenal. I'm not patting him on the back, but I am saying that was an incredible, amazing course that was so enlightening to me. And if you ever have an opportunity, and maybe some of you online have taken last year's or this year's, but if you do have an opportunity to sit with Frank for a couple of days and listen to his talk on food safety culture face to face, you're going to hear it now, but there's a couple of days, and it's like, I want to say it's kind of like an earth-shattering, world eye-opening course to attend. So I do encourage you when the opportunity arises. All right, and then the second on the agenda is, what is it? A food safety game with Corrine. And after that, there were 3 people on here, Tom Neary, Carrie Polga, and Tara Edwards, going to speak about to define, identify, evaluate HACCP plans in the field, which is always an ongoing topic for us. So with that, I would like to have you engage. Please listen, learn today. There are hours ahead of you this morning. Take your time, take notes, and enjoy the session. And one more slide, please. So these are the objectives that you will get out of this advanced boot camp this morning. You'll recognize the difference between traditional food safety management versus a behavior-based food safety approach. You will learn how to influence behavior throughout the understanding of core attributes of an effective food safety culture, enhance skills to define, identify, and evaluate HACCP plans in the field, identify the core attributes of an effective food safety culture. I want you to know that all of these presentations will be presented and available on the AFTO's website in the Bootcamp section after all of the sessions have been completed and uploaded. So they will be there for your resources. And at this point, I will like to hand over the screen to the moderator that we have today, Matthew. There you go. Take it over, Matt, and everyone, please enjoy your session and use those chat and Q&A boxes. Have a great one.
Thank you, Angela. Greatly appreciate it. And thank you for everyone attending today's boot camp. We have a lot of great information ahead for you in today's session. I do want to go ahead and introduce our first speaker today. We have Frank Yanis. He is a food safety leader, futurist, author, and professor, and former FDA Deputy Commissioner for Food Policy and Response from 2018 to 2023, and he has 30 years of leadership at Walmart and Walt Disney companies. So Frank, thank you so much for providing us great information today and joining the boot camp. And I want to turn the floor over to you. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you, Matt. Hopefully you can hear me okay. And Angela, thank you for those kind comments. Really appreciate it. Let me share slides. See if we can get there and if this works. Can you guys see my slides? Slide showing up?
We can see the slides in there, but there are all of them at once. Oh, there you go. Perfect.
There we go. Great.
Yep.
All right. Well, good afternoon. What an impressive group. It's really quite humbling. And I love to see food safety professionals from all over the country engaged in this fashion, especially at the start of a new year, 2025. Well, I'll talk a little bit about 24, and it was a rough and tough year for food safety. And when I look at the years of experience, Angela, I'm also humbled. And I love this about our profession, that most of the folks involved in food safety are committed to continuous learning. So buckle your seatbelts, because I have a lot of ground I want to cover in about 50 minutes. And as you heard from Angela, we have done this twice now through AFTO as a 2-day workshop. And in fact, it's an abbreviated version of a semester-long course, graduate level course I teach at Michigan State University. So we're just going to be able to give you some highlights. But what I want to do is really not present or talk at you this afternoon, but have a conversation with you about going beyond traditional food safety management. And that's creating a food safety culture. Creating a food safety culture. And one of the phrases I often use is that a food safety culture is really a prerequisite to effective food safety management. You can have the best designed food safety procedures, HACCP plans, policies, sometimes even rules and laws, but if they're not put into practice by people, they're almost useless. And so it really is about what people do, how people think about food safety, what do they do at all levels in an organization. And so that's why I titled this Going Beyond Food Safety Management. A little bit about my background, you already heard it. I spent the first 20 years of my career working at the Disney organization. I thought I would retire at Disney, loved working for the mouse. And then after 20 years, decided to make a change and join the world's largest company. I share that with humility, and retailer Walmart. And people often ask me, well, Frank, why did you go to Walmart? And I remind people, 1 out of every $4 spent on food in the United States is spent at a Walmart store. If you want to make a difference, it's a pretty good place to be. I was the global vice president of food safety for Walmart for 10 years. And then in 2018, I started getting calls from a commissioner. And I often say there's a difference between a celebrity commissioner and a regular commissioner. And I was a celebrity commissioner, Scott Gottlieb, and he convinced me to take a dramatic cut in pay, move halfway around the country, and joined FDA. So the joke that I often use, some of you may have heard it, is I say, I went from the happiest place on earth to the busiest place on earth, Walmart, and I ended up, and then I asked the audiences to fill in the blank. Now, this is a group of regulators. I think many of you will say, well, one of the most important regulatory agencies on earth, but oftentimes if there's folks in the private sector, they will take a few shots, and I let them do that. But what I'm going to share is, a lifelong history of learnings of how to influence and try to motivate human behavior. Right at the outset, I'll ask you real quickly at your seat. I really wish we could be together, but when I'm in person, I say, what does this picture have to do with the conversation we're going to have over the next 50 minutes? And when I ask it, people will often say, well, Frank, you're talking maybe about innovation. We have to do things differently if we want to go beyond traditional food safety management. A real common answer that I get is people, well, HACCP, Frank, HACCP was originally invented by Pillsbury and NASA to make sure astronauts could stay safe while they were in space. Some people sometimes say, the importance of actually using more modern controls. And so whatever you're thinking of, just keep that thought in mind, because I'm going to come back to this picture a little bit later. I should also say, for those of you that have seen versions of my talks, they continue to evolve. So, I'm going to share with you maybe some things you haven't heard before. My very favorite question to ask audiences, and I ask this audiences since leaving federal service in every single presentation or discussion I have with food safety professionals. And this past year, I've traveled the world. I've asked it of food safety professionals as far away as Australia and New Zealand and in Japan and in Sweden and in Norway and in the UK and in all corners of the US. Are we winning the battle against foodborne disease? I don't know what your answer is, because we're not in a room and I can't hear people shout out. But I can tell you without reservation, the number one response I generally get in a public setting is no. And oftentimes I'll get a couple of people say no. Occasionally, some people will say, well, Frank, we're not winning the war, but maybe we're winning some battles, and that's a good answer. And sometimes people will say, well, Frank, the battlefield is changing, and that's true. The pathogens evolve and change. The foods that we're consuming have changed. The food system is changing. We have a greater at-risk population. So, think about your answer, but the question is, are we winning the battle against foodborne disease? And I'm going to share with you what I believe, but I told you, most food safety professionals say the answer is no. I like the answer that we've won some battles. And so one of the things I did a couple of years ago, I went to Art Liang, who some of you will remember from CDC, who retired last year. And I asked Art, what were food safety professionals, last century working on? And this is data in a version of a slide that he gave me. And you can see, if we were maybe not microbiologists, but called sanitarians almost 100 years ago, we'd be working on food safety in a different way. And these are the things that would be concerning us. I like to joke that I doubt many of you are worried or looking for tapeworms in people's HACCPs plans. But I do like to ask, what pathogens do you not see on this slide? And oftentimes people will say, well, Frank, Listeria is in the news almost every day and every week. I don't see Listeria on your slide. People will say, well, Frank, we're really concerned about Shiga toxin producing E. coli. I don't see them. How about the number one cause of foodborne disease, norovirus, and the skyrocketing number of cases we're seeing right now around the nation? Cyclospora, and I could go on and on. And so we are fighting different battles today. And in some respects, I think the battles that we're facing today, I could describe them, although, they might always feel this way as last mile battles. They're a little bit tougher. We've picked the low hanging fruit off of the tree. And the battles that we're facing now are a little bit more challenging. But this is why I think people say, no, I don't think we're winning the battle. And especially in 24, I don't know if you feel this way, there's been almost a daily, certainly a weekly drumbeat of outbreaks and recalls in the news. If you're like me, you're trying to follow this pretty closely, right? It's hard for me to keep up with all the recalls and outbreaks that are being reported. And so I just picked a few that were in the papers and in the news over the year 2024. I could have picked a lot many, and it's not to pick on any one of these, but how about cantaloupes involved in outbreaks again? And this one actually pretty big, 15 deaths across North America between Canada and the US. How many times have we seen cantaloupes involved in outbreaks? How about the picture or image in the center there? I mean, that should have caused a little bit of outrage in all of us. In fact, I think it should have resulted in congressional hearings, and it did not. How about children in the United States, in the 21st century, experiencing lead poisoning because a producer manufactured a product, marketed very cleverly and enticingly for children, applesauce in these pouches that you can suck. And there was high levels of lead. That doesn't feel like we're winning in a modern 21st century society. And how about some of the big brands, beyond hamburgers, right? But this is a brand that's been around for a long time. We've seen other brands, some, with long, rich histories, involved in outbreaks, including Listeria. And so these stories and these news cycles of outbreaks that are still occurring in the United States and recalls certainly doesn't make it feel like we're winning the battle against foodborne disease. Some of you might be thinking, well, Frank, there's a reason for that. And I'm going to get to that because I recently wrote a column that I titled Straight Talk on Outbreaks and Recalls, and no spin. And I'll share a little bit about what I mean regarding that. And this is another reason why it doesn't feel like we're winning. The weekly or almost daily deluge of recalls, right? We've seen a lot of recalls. If you haven't seen this report, I encourage you to go take a look. I think the paper might be available online, but it was published a few months ago, actually now almost more than a year ago, in the Journal of Food Protection. And these authors did a really nice job of looking back at recalls of FDA regulated foods. And we know FDA regulates the lion's share of the food system. And in this 21-year period of time, you can see there were over 35,000 recalls. And believe it or not, if you really categorize recalls by the reason in which they occur, well, oftentimes the number one reason is allergens. If you really do discrete characterization of the reason for the recalls, over that 21-year period, the number one reason for recalls was listeriosis. And boy, is it's rearing its ugly head as we speak. And then while these recalls weren't distributed evenly over time, I just did some rough math to kind of get directionally, how many recalls is that? And it would have been roughly equivalent to about 5 food recalls a day. Crazy, 5 recalls a day. That's a lot of recalls. Now, the straight talk on, are these outbreaks and recalls a sign that the food system is working? Because I have to tell you, over the past few months, I've been a little bit rattled by the number of media stories I've seen. Clearly, media reporters want to understand what's happening and report on it. They've called many of our colleagues and professionals to talk about it. And occasionally I'll see some of our colleagues say, well, these outbreaks and recalls are a sign that the food system is working. Well, I think, people can have their perspectives, and I think the people that answer that way are well-intended. I think those answers really miss the mark. Well, we're going to talk a little bit about enhanced foodborne disease surveillance, allowing us to detect signals of illnesses earlier, and that's a really good thing. How do you tell that? Like I've had to talk to the parents of a child that passed away because they ate contaminated romaine that killed them or disabled them for life. How do you tell them, well, yeah, that's a sign that the food system is working. And the recalls, I don't know about you, I'm a student of Edward Deming, and to me, any recall, the fact that the food has been produced, it's been put into commerce, and then it has to be retrieved. And remember, the studies on average, a recall costs about $10 million, and sometimes recalls are very disruptive because they affect other suppliers down the chain. For us to say a recall is a sign that the system is working, I think is unacceptable. And we can't accept the status quo type of mindset. So to me, signs of outbreaks and recalls are signs that there's still work to do. Another reason why we don't feel we're winning, this is a study, if you haven't seen it, a Gallup survey that was done in 2024, a very reputable polling organization, obviously, and you could see that trust in government assurance to protect the food supply is at an all-time low. And if you read this study, and if you haven't, I encourage you to do so, you dig down, there's a loss of trust in industry's ability to do so as well. But here's the ultimate slide, and this is why Frank Yanis says, no, we're not winning the battle. I want to win the battle. And it's this idea, I use another Deming quote that says, in God we trust, all others bring data. And when I was at the agency at FDA, oftentimes commissioners, especially this last commissioner, Rob Califf, would want to get in front of Congress and say, we have the safest food system in the world. And I would say, with all due respect, sir, please don't say that. You might say we have among the safest, but we don't know, and I don't believe that we can say we have the safest food system. You can say that we might have one of the best foodborne disease surveillance systems in the world. And that's because of the great work all of you do in the states, as well as the CDC and FDA and USDA with foodborne disease surveillance. And many of you are familiar with the data that you're seeing up here on the slide. It's the incidence of foodborne disease in our nation standardized as a rate by 100,000 population. This is my guiding post almost every day. And FoodNet, we're doing what we call aggressive as opposed to passive surveillance in large population sites around the country. But what I like to show here is if you look at 1996, hopefully you can see my cursor moving, and let's just pick salmonella. There were about 15 cases per 100,000 population in 96. Fast forward to the most reporting period, the most current reporting period that I found on CDC's website. What do you see? A little bit higher than 15 cases per 100,000 population. Pick another pathogen. Can't be. Let's look after an initial drop. 1999, about 15 cases. Fast forward to 22, you were starting to approach 20 cases. And you can pick your pathogen. And with this slide, and if we could have discussions, I'd love to facilitate a discussion on this, basically says that the incidence of foodborne disease in the United States has remained fairly flat for greater than 2 decades. The incidence of foodborne disease in the United States has remained fairly flat for over 2 decades. And when I was in federal service, one of the mantras I had is we have to bend this curve of foodborne illness. Yeah, I appreciate activity, I appreciate action, but that's not what really matters. What matters most to the American people, to you and I, is better public health outcomes. Now, some people will say, Frank, detection is getting really good. And that's true. But there have been periods here when we went from pulse field jelly electrophoresis to whole genome sequencing. Whole genome sequencing isn't completely new, and you don't see significant shifts. And so I don't think we could say just because enhanced foodborne disease alone, this is what's happening. I don't think we could say that alone. And then I say, if that's the case, we can't use that as a crutch. Just like we've modernized how we detect foodborne illnesses, we have to modernize how we prevent foodborne illnesses. And so there's no question we're getting better at making the invisible visible. This is just to depict, now because of whole genome sequencing, we can see cases of foodborne disease that historically have been defined as sporadic, below the iceberg, under the water. We didn't think they were related to food, but now because we have similar genetic sequences, we start asking smart questions. We say, oh, there's a food. Now, because of the digital footprint that we have, here's an outbreak that occurred in Denmark. Danish epidemiologists didn't know what was causing the illnesses. It was a Shiga toxin producing E. coli. They looked at purchase records using electronic means, credit cards and loyalty cards, found out that most ill cases had eaten a particular brand of sausage, tested the sausage, found the outbreak strain, outbreak solved. And then this last one here might be a study that you're familiar with. If not, I encourage you to look it up. It was published in the Journal of Emerging Infectious Diseases by CDC that said, hey, the maple leaf outbreak that we all remember years ago, these authors concluded, hey, had we been looking for what Canadians had been searching on search engines such as Google, we might have detected the outbreak before traditional health reporting because people were searching for terms such as listeriosis. So maybe there might be a way for us to advance a field that we often describe as infodemiology as opposed to epidemiology. But nevertheless, it's good that we're detecting these clusters of cases early, hopefully keeping outbreaks smaller. And I hope, in 25, we do a better job of investigating why they're happening and do better root cause investigations. So the analogy I've used, and this analogy is probably truer today than at any point in my 35-year career, is that, listen, all of us today, 600 people on, and everybody that's involved in the ag sector at large is in this race. And the race is between our ability to detect foodborne illnesses, which is a good thing, and I hope we continue to make public health investments and get even better, and our ability to prevent. And what I don't think is we're not accelerating prevention strategies as quickly and as effectively as we should. And that's why you're on this call. So I don't think we're winning. If you look at what we would refer to the lagging indicators of food safety, if you look at the leading indicators of food safety, I don't think we're winning there either. And this is just a quick snapshot, but I can tell you since I've left federal service, I consult with a lot of companies. I go in and look at a lot of records, and I find these patterns and trends widespread across the nation and other countries as well. And what I picked, knowing that I'd be on with AFNO members, was out of compliance rates for risk factors at retail delis across the United States. Now, the time period is limited because FDA now reports the data a little differently, a little bit more difficult to report in and out of compliance rates. I'm still going to try to do that and extend it into the 20s, but I suspect the pattern isn't going to change much. And here, what you see over a 10-year period is if you looked at out of compliance risk factors, Whether it was improper hot holding, 10-year period, not a lot of difference. Poor personal hygiene, not a lot of difference. Protection from contamination, not a lot of difference. Inadequate cooking, chemicals, unfit for. Same thing. Lagging indicators, incidence of foodborne disease, fairly flat. Leading indicators, risk factors, fairly flat. And so my new way of thinking about this, respected colleagues, is that I do think there's never been a more important time, in my view, than right now. And it's a good way to start the new year, 2025, with this idea that we have to rethink food safety. And you can look up the definition of rethinking. It really is about us pausing for a moment. We're also really busy, pausing and taking the time to have very candid discussions, debates among ourselves, among colleagues to say, is what we're doing effective? Or should we be modifying our approaches? There's a lot that I think we need to think. I don't have time. I could have just spent this entire hour talking about what are things we need to rethink. I think we need to rethink how we do hazard analysis and risk assessments. I was trained in HACCP. HACCP is really focused on hazards. Hazards and risks are different. Campylobacter is a hazard. Cross-contamination or maybe recontamination or undercooking is the risk. And so we need to advance our view of HACCP and risk management. I think we need to rethink environmental monitoring. I see a lot of people doing environmental monitoring in food production plants, rarely detecting the signals that they should detect. And we need to rethink sanitary design. I personally think we need to completely revamp our view on effective food safety controls. When I was trained in HACCP many, many years ago, I was trained in HACCP in the 80s. When I was trained in HACCP, we used to talk about CCP 1s and CCP 2s. I doubt there's anybody out there that's as old as I am thinking about that. But a CCP 1 was an absolute CCP. And I think we need to have a new model or mindset on what type of controls are most effective, because we're lumping them all together. And engineering controls that can allow you to achieve a CCP 1 should always be our choice over administrative controls that are reliant or dependent on people to do the right thing at the right time. So there's a lot we need to rethink. But another one, and that's what we're doing here today, is we need to rethink, how do we better influence human behavior? Why is it time to do a rethink? Well, I love this quote by Albert Einstein, and when I do this in person, I usually get a good laugh, but it's an important statement to think about. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And there are times, folks, and I will grant it, I'm trying to be intentionally provocative today. So allow me to be a little bit provocative, all in the spirit of trying to make improvements on behalf of the consumer. If we're going to go out and do what we did in 24, do you think we're going to get different results in 25? No. And 24 wasn't such a great year for food safety. And so the bottom line is what's gotten us to this point in the profession, yeah, there's been progress made. You think about canning and pasteurization and HACCP, but we've got to continue to move forward. And I do want to, in one of these decades before I retire, be able to say, hey, the first decade, we met the Healthy People decade goals because we didn't meet the Healthy People 2010 goals for food safety. We didn't meet the Healthy People 2020 goals for food safety. And I don't know if we'll meet the Healthy People 2030 goals for food safety, but I think we can. Now, why do I think we have to rethink? What I've seen over the course of my career is that I believe food safety professionals have too few tools in their toolbox. And it's because of the way we get trained, right? I was trained, when I came out of college, I was armed with 3 primary tools and Frank Yanis's toolbox. Training, Frank, you got to train employees, and if you just train them, they'll do the right things. Now we all know, just because you train somebody doesn't mean you change their behavior. Inspections, Frank, and I know Frank, we're doing better inspections, we're doing risk-based inspections, but they're still inspections. That doesn't super impress me. And then micro testing. And for the microbiologists in the audience, don't get offended. I am a microbiologist by training. I started off at the bench. Some people will say, Frank, we have better rapid methods today, and that's great, and I like to leverage them, but testing alone won't get us out of this mess. And I always remind people, even with the most robust sampling plans, remember that a consuming public will always be more sensitive than any sampling plan you can create. And so
While the chat is answering my question, are we frozen? And I'm going to say, yes, we did. We're frozen. Oh, we might have you back.
We see him moving.
Do we have you back, Frank? You're on mute.
I am. Where did you lose me?
Just 2 minutes ago.
2 minutes ago?
Can you step your notes back by 2 minutes?
Okay, let me see. Can you see my slide again?
Yes.
FDA and the chicken.
Okay. All right. Well, let's do this. My call to action is that we need to add more tools to our toolbox. So just pretend I was doing a demonstration for you here today where I was cutting raw chicken on a cutting board. And after I cut the raw chicken, I basically moved the chicken parts to the side and started cutting a head of lettuce. What would that be? And if we were together, everybody would yell cross-contamination. And I would tell you, good answer, but it's the wrong answer. It's a human behavior. I ask people, what do you think my job was at Walmart? And sometimes people say, well, Frank, you need to make sure they have good programs in place. You need to have a good HACCP plan. And I say, nice answers, but they're the wrong answers. My job was to be the chief food safety culture ambassador to try to influence the behaviors of 2.2 million employees around the world so they were doing food safety the right way at the right time. And even when I was deputy commissioner, I used to tell my team, your job isn't simply to write rules, and your job isn't simply to conduct enforcement or do inspections. Our jobs are to try to influence the behaviors of the millions of men and women that work in the regulated establishments that we oversee. And so if you were to ask me to define food safety, let's see, I've got a little bit of a stick now here, a little bit of a delay. I would say it's not a fancy codex definition. It's this definition that food safety equals behavior, nothing more, nothing less. It's impossible to advance food safety without influencing the behaviors of maybe the leaders in the organization, their attitudes, whether they make investments and change processes. You have to influence the behaviors of mid-level leaders, and you certainly have to influence the behaviors of people that work on the line. And how do you do that? Well, it's not through programs. I can tell you, I've seen this my entire career, but it's through this idea of culture. So in the time we have remaining, I want to very quickly answer 4 basic questions. 1, what is a food safety culture? 2, why the focus on food safety culture? Frank, why have you spent your entire career emphasizing this so much? I want to talk a little bit about who creates a food safety culture. And then we're going to close trying to give you a flavor for how is a food safety culture strengthened, shaped, and created. Because too many times I feel these talks on culture and webinars and in conferences are a little bit what I call too much pom-pom bubblegum. Like, food safety culture, yeah, but we don't really talk about the behavioral science techniques and principles on how to get it done. So if I had the time, I'd say, hey, take a notepad out, write your definition of food safety culture. And the reason I like to do this in classroom settings is when I've done this with food safety professionals over the years, it's gotten better, but in the early years, if I asked 50 people to give me a definition of food safety culture, I would get 50 very different definitions. If I asked 50 people to define pH or water activity, for example, the definitions would be more similar. So here's a definition that I like. And the point is not for you to memorize it, but to understand some key attributes of it. Culture is shared patterns of thoughts and behavior. It's what the people in an organization, whether it's the employees in a company, whether it's the food service workers in a county, in an organization or social group, think and how it characterizes that group. And culture is also learned through socialization. I often use this phrase that food safety can be caught and not only taught. Food safety can be caught and not only taught, because people will do what other people do. And also, if you make food safety part of the culture in this manner, one of the things I like to emphasize is that it generally persists over time, a little bit longer than a program. You know, nobody wants food safety to be the flavor of the month or this year's focus or a priority. Priorities are very different than culture. And so this is what a food safety culture is. And I want you to kind of understand the major elements of culture so that when you get asked about it, it doesn't seem like this vague, abstract, and soft stuff. Now, trust me, I know it is. I've been challenged and said, Frank, why are you talking about food safety culture here at the IFP annual meeting? This is about microbiologists and the hard sciences. And my response, when I get that, and when I got it the very first time, was because it's the soft stuff, human behavior and culture, that I think is the hard stuff. And I think all of you state inspectors certainly understand this. The second question I wanted to answer is, why the focus on culture, Frank? There's a lot we could be talking about today. We could be talking about red dye number 3. We could be talking about FDA's new ag water standard, FDA's food traceabilities rule, which is near and dear to my heart. But I think there probably aren't too many topics more important than culture. So it's a good one. And why the focus? Think about a catastrophic event that's happened in our country or in a country that you've been in. And it resulted in either loss of human life or property damage. And think about how you recall, because governments will do this, they'll bring the smartest men and women together to investigate why it happened. And what did they determine? Did they determine it was faulty design? Did they determine it was operator error? Or sometimes people like to blame a dummy in an organization. That rarely exists. How about the improper training? If you've worked in an organization of any size, you almost chuckle at this, how many times leader says, well, we need to retrain people. Or was it organizational culture? And this takes me to that picture. Remember that picture I showed at the beginning? Space Shuttle Columbia took off from Kennedy Space Center in 2003. Shortly after takeoff, some of the fuel tanks here, 2 fuel tanks, were insulated with foam material. Some of the foam material came off and hit the leading edge of the left wing. NASA didn't know it at the time, but the underbelly of that left wing got a microscopic fracture that could not be seen by the naked eye. Some of you will recall this shuttle was lined with thermal insulation tile because when the shuttle re-entered the Earth's atmosphere, it experienced a tremendous amount of heat. Make a long story short, when the shuttle re-entered the Earth's atmosphere, because there was a fracture of that insulation tile, the wing started to vibrate, it started to come apart. It disintegrated, as did the entire shuttle, into tiny pieces, and all 7 astronauts on board tragically died. NASA did what government should do in catastrophes of this nature. They assembled smart people to investigate how in the heck could something like this happen. They published 2 volumes, thick books. In fact, right here in my office, there's a bookshelf, and those 2 volumes are still sitting there. I read this report in 2004, so you can see 20 years ago, and I can still remember one sentence that stood out to me, and it's this one here. In our view, the NASA organizational culture had as much to do with this accident as the foam. See, it wasn't just about the mechanical engineering, the mechanical science of the materials used in the construction of the foam on these tanks, or maybe even the thermal insulation tile. They concluded that the culture at the organization that allowed the decisions that were made also contributed to this crisis, and were probably a bigger factor in it. And that sentence has always struck me. And I like to say, hey, listen, I have a crystal ball. Unfortunately, I think there's going to be a catastrophe in 2025. I think, once again, governments, wherever it occurs around the world, will hire the smartest men and women to investigate it. And I can predict, and you can say, hey, Giannis told me this in January 25. This is what the headline will read. Something like this. It will always be about culture. The BP oil spill, you can see it wasn't just about the cheaper cement that they used to build this rig, but that inquiry chief said it was a culture of complacency that allowed those decisions to happen. How many of you remember General Motors and their failed ignition switches? This is a mother and father testifying in front of Congress. Their daughter tragically died. That cultural probes blamed the culture at General Motors. And in fact, they described it as a culture of siloed information, where the right information to prevent this could have gotten into the hands of people that needed to know, but it was such a big and distributed organization that they were siloed. Reminding me a little bit of what I experienced with the infant formula crisis at FDA. And this is the NASA one that I described to you. So I like to say, I actually believe, and I don't know if you would agree with me, that I think many foodborne outbreaks have as much to do with organizational culture than they do the pathogen's ability to contaminate or survive in a food. Peanut Corporation of America is a perfect example. I don't think this was just about Salmonella's ability to survive in a low moisture food. How about melamine and powdered infant formula? You think that was a chemistry problem or a cultural problem? Or more recently, Chronobacter in a very large company's powdered infant formula. Do you think that was a microbiological recontamination problem alone, or a cultural problem, maybe a culture of complacency because there's such a reliance on an N30 sampling plan? And not to pick on the ice cream manufacturer that had an outbreak, but with listeriosis, but you could very easily see, hey, I'm producing a product that doesn't support the growth of listeria, maybe a culture of complacency. And so I think a lot of foodborne outbreaks are more to do with culture than they are microbiology. They're both involved, but we have to remember the role of culture. Who creates culture? Now, if I were in a room with you, many of you say, well, we all do, Frank, right? Here's my favorite definition to really put light and an exclamation point on it. And if you're interested in this topic of culture and you want to read and learn more, there's no better author to read than Edgar Schein, who's passed away now, but is the founding father of this concept of organizational culture. And this quote was powerful. He said, organizational cultures are created by leaders. And one of the most decisive functions of leadership may well be the creation and management, if and when necessary, the destruction of culture. So cultures generally start at the top and flow downward. And so when I enter new organizations, I'm very focused on all of the stakeholder groups I need to influence. But clearly, I'm very interested in the leadership team, including the board and the CEO. I look at mid-level leaders and line workers, but a food safety culture would generally be started at the top. And then let's spend the rest of our time on how is it created? How is a food safety culture created? Because it's not magic. And here's a quote from what I think is a pretty smart Greek philosopher. Generally, that's intended for humor and people laugh, but it makes the point. Food safety culture is a choice. And what I found over the course of my career is that when companies have a catastrophic event, they really get focused on creating food safety culture. I think you and I want companies to be focused on food safety culture to prevent the catastrophic event, as opposed to a reaction to the catastrophic event. How do you do it? One quick takeaway, and we'll make these slides available, is you can't do it with food science alone. And so it really is this idea, not that novel but difficult, of blending food science, food microbiology, food science, and I know that there's hazards beyond biological, but food science, let's say, with behavioral science principles and principles of organizational dynamics. And when you blend these two together, that's how you create this effective prerequisite so that you can create effective food safety management systems. And I call that the difference between the traditional food safety management systems that I've seen us working on as a profession for 30 years to one that's a little bit more behavior and human focused. Listen, we're a long ways off from having total automation and robots make our food. And food production in the United States and globally is still largely a human endeavor. We saw that with COVID. Why did we have disruptions? Because we rely on people to produce, grow, and make food. And we need to understand, how do we influence people? And so it's focusing on the people and the process. It's leveraging additional insights and science, a little bit more multidimensional. It's really understanding that behavior change is pretty complex. It's not just you train them and they'll change, and involves more of a systems thinking mindset. I know that many of you might have a background in behavioral science, but if you don't, I encourage you to actually study some of the best or your favorite behavioral science theories and models. I've published a book called Food Safety Equals Behaviors, where I talk about 30 proven behavioral science principles that I think are very applicable for our profession. And what I want to share is, while over my career, I've seen there are some companies that have very strong food safety cultures, like I said, generally after a catastrophic event. And you can go look at them, right? Jack in the Box then became a role model after the early 90s incident. Maple Leaf, strong food safety culture after their outbreak. Chipotle, strong food safety culture. What I've determined and concluded, while no two great food safety cultures are alike, they have many similar attributes. And I use a model that's published in my book that's based on 4 core attributes or principles or dimensions, and they're these. One is, those companies do an excellent job of making sure that food safety expectations are crystal clear for all employees in the organization. 2, they educate and train their employees on food safety, and all employees. It doesn't matter where you work, whether you work on the front line, whether you're in maintenance, whether you're in procurement, everyone understands their role in it. They communicate food safety frequently, with communication and culture being 2 sides of the same coin. They establish goals and measurements, and I'm going to go into each and every one of these in a little bit of detail. Don't have a lot of time. And they create consequences for food safety. There can be positive consequences and there could be negative ones. So the first one, I'm just going to kind of whet your appetite, because you say, okay, Frank, those statements sound good. How do you do this? Just let me just do a real fast round robin. What do you think is the #1 reason why employees don't do what they're supposed to do for food safety, or for anything for that matter? Where studies have repeatedly showed that the #1 reason employees don't do what they're supposed to do is they just don't know what to do. So to create a food safety culture, and starting off ensuring those expectations are clear, we have to do good risk assessments, not just hazard analysis. Identify the risks or behaviors that we need employees to actually adhere to, and educate and train them on it. And one of the things I've done always is identify what matters most. Yeah, there's 101 things we need them to do. But at Walmart, for example, we created the food safety high five, and you can see, be clean, be healthy, keep it cold, keep it hot, don't cross-contaminate, wash, rinse, sanitize, cook it and chill it. But more importantly, we really tried to talk about the specific behaviors that people should follow, of hand washing, not working while ill, never touching ready-to-eat foods with your bare hands, the temperatures involved. Another thing I like to bucket under this dimension of expectations is linking food safety to the values and beliefs of either the organization or people, as opposed to trying to sell it as a policy. And I could spend 30 minutes talking about behavioral science studies that say values and beliefs are more effective at influencing human behavior than policies. So at Walmart, they had 3 basic beliefs that are in bold up top, and we linked food safety to those beliefs. And I would tell Walmart associates and executives, you have to do food safety well, not because it's in the FDA food code, but it's part of your basic beliefs. If you respect the individual, you have to care about their safety, and then telling them exactly what you needed them to do. And then one last thing I'll say in terms of expectations, sometimes the best way to influence human behavior is through design. And so I often look at, how do I design the work in a manner so that it's not reliant on people having to make the right decision, and it's just safe. And for example, we took a 16-step rotisserie preparation procedure and distilled it down to 6. Another thing you have to do well is train and educate. And I say there's a difference between training and education. Why do we train? It's not just to impart knowledge, although we want to impart knowledge and skills. We want to change attitudes, but we want to influence behaviors. And when you get this deck, you'll see a list of things that I think are good tips. Draw the distinction between education and training. Education is the why, but you got to show them the how. Look at your training. If it's just imparting knowledge, it's probably not too effective. Talk about real consequences and use stories instead of statistics. I often say, what's more effective? Telling your audience that there's 48 million cases of foodborne disease annually in the United States, or the story of one, like I've done, telling the story of maybe a child that was affected due to foodborne disease and using that to captivate and gain people's attention. Be willing to teach both at work and at home food safety. Sometimes the at home sticks better. Leveraging behavioral science principles such as commitment, which if people give you a verbal or written commitment, they're more likely to follow through, as opposed to getting people just to sign a roster that they've attended the training. Make it visual in the social norm. In the course, we talk about, there are studies that show the more people you show in a video demonstrating the behavior, the more likely it is for people to follow. So if you're creating a hand washing video, show 3 or 4 associates doing it the right way, as opposed to just one. And the power of telling stories of the mistakes that people happen so that you can teach experience and not just knowledge. The third point I'll make is communication. Communication and culture are two sides of the same coin, but understanding how your employees like to receive information, arming leaders with the talking points to make sure that they're hearing about food safety from their leaders, because if they're not, trust me, they don't think it's part of the culture. I like to leverage a principle in the behavioral literature called homophily. So rather than the food safety leader, I never taught and trained food safety at Walmart. I looked for employees that were very interactive and dynamic to do the teaching and training, because that leverages a behavioral science principle of likeness. Employees are going to listen to people that are more like them. Leverage who's a good influencer. In this case, I brought in Trace Atkins, a famous country music star, to talk about allergies. His daughter had food allergies. In the course, we go through how do you create effective visual symbols and prompts, because a lot of what we see posted in restaurants and retails are not very effective, and the importance of asking questions and maybe even doing a food safety culture survey. Goals and measurements, just a couple of highlights here. Draw a distinction between leading indicators and lagging indicators. Lagging indicators is a lot of what companies like to measure. Are we having recalls? Do we have complaints? Are there foodborne illnesses? But look at the things that would prevent these types of outcomes in the first place. Convert from what I call third-party measurements, companies relying on the health department or a third party to come in and measure and tell them how they're doing food safety, to what I call first-party measurements, the self-checks that they do every day. And certainly there's power in digitizing. And if I had time, I could tell you how food safety data on a piece of paper is a dead end, but food safety data in digital form is the beginning of meaningful action, allowing you to trend and compare and to innovate. And then the last thing I'll say is create positive consequences for food safety performance as well as negative. The behavioral literature is clear. Generally, you get better results if you do a ratio of positive consequences to negative in a range of 4 to 1 to 10 to 1. And if you think about your best teachers, your best coaches, your best instructors, they were really encouraging. And so look for opportunities to catch people doing food safety right. That doesn't mean that if we catch them to not following standards and violations, we're not going to hold them to account. But let's use that mental model of being good umpires, and that when we catch people doing things right, we're going to celebrate and give them a pat on the back. And so you can create kind of a tiered recognition process, and whether it's on the spot recognition or something that's more structured. I'd love to stay connected. I'm glad that you're interested in this topic and that you've tuned in. I do teach a college course, and we'll do it again in June on Michigan State University, lovely campus. I do have a couple of books. I know we've done it now twice with AFTA. We'll have conversations about doing it again, hopefully maybe later this year or next year. I encourage you to attend. Then I'll close with a statement that isn't original, but it's so true. And I just want to thank you. And it's this idea that this food system is pretty big. Oftentimes people think it's the feds that keep food safe. I know we have a lot of people at the state and local level. Over the course of my career, I've seen what an important role the states play in advancing food safety for this country. And so I want to thank you for that. And then with this idea that alone we can do so little, but like we are here today, 600 plus together, we can do so much. Thank you all for your time. Thank you for what you're doing to keep consumers safe, and best wishes.
Thank you, Frank, very much for that information. A lot of good information that we can all take back to our departments and through our daily duties as inspectors and regulators. We do have some time for some questions. There was one question that I kind of pulled a little bit from two questions into one, which is really good. Let me see if I can get that. As regulators, how do we fit into the organizational culture of a firm we are inspecting? What is our role and how do we contribute? And pulling from another question that kind of piggybacks on that is we're only in there, but so often we're not in there on a regular basis. So that's a kind of pulling the two questions together. Yeah.
Those are great questions, Matt, and thanks for asking. And number one is, I would get this question a lot when I was at FDA. Well, Frank, why are you talking about food safety culture at FDA? The FDA can't regulate. And we could talk about where are we going with culture because it's evolving. You've seen the European Union now is requiring it in regulations that companies work on food safety culture. But in the US, I would say, you're right, we can't regulate food safety culture, but we can as regulators, encourage it. We can observe it, and we might be able to even utilize it someday in terms of how we do risk prioritization. So the main thing I think we need to do is kind of encourage and be able to recognize those establishments that have good food safety culture and figure out how we might use it in our programs. I think, secondly, I would say, Matt, is really spend some time trying to understand these human behavioral science principles and leverage it in our programs. I'll give you a perfect example. There's this behavioral science principle of commitment that I mentioned, which says this: if I commit to something in writing, or I commit to it verbally, if I were to study two different control groups, the ones that committed in writing or verbally would be more effective at following through than ones that did not. So why not leverage these types of behavioral science principles in how we do our work? So for example, if I were issuing a permit or a license to operate an establishment, I wouldn't say pay the fee and sign here. I would write a principle of commitment where I would have the operator pay the fee, but commit to me in writing that they're going to adhere or maintain their facility in conformance with state regulations. If I were developing a training program, I might use the principle of social norm that says the more people see something, this is the principle of social norm, Matt, in a nutshell. Most of the listeners here probably shop on Amazon. What do you look for? The products that have 5 stars or 2 stars? You look for 5 stars because we all want to make mental shortcuts. If everybody else says it's good, maybe it's what I should be doing. So I can tell you, I've been a failure at this. I've created hand washing videos where I show an associate doing hand washing the right way, and it's just one associate. But if you understand the principle of social norm, you would create a hand washing video where you would show how to do the hand washing the right way, but you might have 3 or 4 different employees in that video, maybe of demographic backgrounds that represent the workforce, because it communicates not only how to do it, but boy, if everybody else is doing it, maybe I should do it. So an answer is you could start by saying, how do I leverage some of these principles on how I administer a food safety compliance oversight program?
Very good. Thank you very much on that. And we have probably time for one more question. Is there data regarding what may be the current or least effective methods of increasing compliance and or promoting food safety culture? Was a question that came in.
The least effective, well, I can tell you, I don't think I don't think the punitive way alone is working. I think this is what we've used as the profession for so long, right? We go in there and we measure, and just because we leave an inspection report behind, we think that's going to change human behavior. There's very little data that suggests that's the case. And then we like to use the punitive, right? It's the cops giving speeding tickets, right? And so, this is just an encouragement. I don't think what we're doing is necessarily working, so we need to kind of regroup.
And looks like I might have time for one more question. One of the questions came in as it relates to AI, and any thoughts on the application of AI in food safety and how making food safety more efficient, or how it relates to food safety culture using AI.
I love it. I love it,
application.
Matt. I do think we need to pause and think, how can we use some new emerging technologies such as AI and digital tools to strengthen culture? And I actually think it might be the topic of a future book, which is how digital may hold some of our greatest promise to change human behavior. You think about all the work that we do, we're trying to change human behavior in the establishments that we regulate, but digital prompts can change human behavior. And I have examples where I've tried to change behavior by training and education, and then I give the workforce a digital prompt, and I drive compliance rates down within a week or two when I couldn't change them by training and education. Another thing that I think AI is very useful for, and something I did when I was at FDA, is it can strengthen predictive analytics. And some of you might have heard me talk about the seafood AI pilot that we did that showed we could predict violative seafood shipments by 300 and increased about 300%, which shipments would be violative. So think if we could leverage, we have a lot of data, AI to tell us, what are the areas that we should be focused on, or which establishments we should be regulating. So I think you could target it both to trying to influence human behavior and strengthen culture, and also direct our work.
Good. And so I think this will be the last question here. And
They
this
keep on coming.
Yeah, and this kind of goes to the question of going back towards the beginning of your presentation, when you were talking about the different illnesses that were being discovered and that was coming to our attention. And the question came in that it would be interesting to know if we're catching more items of concern, or are there more items of concern?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a lot of people will argue that our detection is getting so good that maybe we're picking up things that didn't matter. I don't know anybody that can answer that definitively. It's similar to the analogy, hey, when we improve diagnostic on certain medical diseases, we find a lot, let's say, prostate cancer. But again, my admonition to this group is to not use that as a crutch, to say, hey, these are things that were always happening, and so it's not that it's getting worse. Hey, if we know people are getting sick, if we now know people are dying, we have an obligation to fix it. And so the take-home message is, if we're getting better at detection, let's get better at prevention.
Very good. Well, thank you, Frank. We greatly appreciate that. For those who are in attendance, we do have some other questions that came in, and we're working on capturing those questions, and we'll work on getting some answers to those. And those will be posted in the AFTO Bootcamp website where you registered. We'll have some answers to some of the questions we weren't able to get to today. But thank you very much, Frank. We greatly appreciate your presentation and information, and a lot of good information to take back to our departments and our workplace.
My pleasure. And thanks for everyone for what you're doing. You play a big role in this country's food safety oversight. Stay safe.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it. So right now we will move to a fun period in our boot camp session. We're going to have the "What Is It?" a food safety game, and I'm going to turn it over to Corrine Peplowski, and we're going to bring the fun to the boot camp. Corrine is our boot camp work group. She is the environmental specialist for Peoria County Health Department for at least 16 years. So we're in good hands, and the floor is yours, Corrine.
Great, thank you so much. I'm gonna pull up my my PowerPoint here real quick, and while I'm doing that, I'd just like to thank Frank again I am a graduate of the MSU Food Safety Program, and I took Frank's course over the summer, and it was great. So if you guys are ever considering going back to school for your master's degree, I definitely recommend the MSU Food Safety Program. All right, so hopefully you guys can see my screen. We have a game here for you. It's called What Is It? A game of mystery and intrigue for field inspectors. The rules are pretty simple. I'm going to pull up a slide. Each slide contains a picture, and there'll be 4 options for what that picture is. I want you to take your best guess at what that picture is showing. Then there'll be a poll that pops up for every picture, every slide, and you're going to put your guess as to what it is in the poll. Please do not put it in the chat. Sometimes it can really bog down any other conversations or questions that people have. So make sure that you do put it in the poll itself, and you want to be quick. The polling window will block the picture, and so you really won't have a second look at that picture. So make sure you look at it right away and try to be as quick as possible. All right, here we go. So what is it? Is this a giant accordion, an apple cider press, a potato paste crusher, or a dough feeding system? And it looks like the poll is up, and we'll give you a little bit of time to answer, and then the poll will close. All right, hopefully you guys have got your guesses in. So 46% of you guessed correctly. This is an apple cider press. But potato paste crusher and dough feeding system, those it definitely could be, right? You really can't tell from this picture. So when you're inspecting apple cider, and I don't know if you do in your jurisdictions or not, I am in Illinois. And in Illinois, we do inspect our apple cider that's produced at the retail level. And it is almost always the pressing is conducted and sold on the farm where those apples are grown. The inspection process in the equipment is very different than your typical restaurant inspection. So it's literally sometimes in a barn, a legitimate barn, or they may have a separate shed. And you're still inspecting the things that you would normally inspect for in a restaurant, except for the processing is just very different and very unique. So apple cider pressing is considered juicing, and they are packaging that juice. So that is considered a special process in the FDA food code. And because it's a special process, there are its own unique food safety risks associated with the pressing of apple cider. Any sort of juice that is packaged at the retail level specifically is not required to be pasteurized, which makes it a little bit extra dangerous because there's no kill step then involved. And so anything that's on those apples, so think like bird poo, that sort of thing, that is going to get into the cider in the end. There is a washing process, but sometimes that's not the most effective way to remove those pathogens. And so that's why so many illnesses come from unpasteurized juice and unpasteurized apple cider. So we're really concerned with things like E. coli 0157H7, which are able to survive that processing of the cider. So if you are inspecting any sort of packaged juice or apple cider, you want to make sure that the juice is treated under a HACCP plan with a 5 log reduction. So that would be pasteurization. Or at the retail level, if you're not treating it, you are allowed to label it with a warning statement that says that the product has not been pasteurized. So when you're doing these inspections, just make sure that that warning statement exists on that packaging. Some apple cider productions, they use a UV treatment. That is not really considered pasteurization. It may get that 5 log reduction, but because it does not use heat, it's not actually considered pasteurization. So you just have to be a little bit cautious with that UV treatment on the apple cider. All right. If you have any questions, put them in the Q&A or in the chat, and we're going to move on to the next slide. So what is it? Is this bleach to make sanitizer with? Is it a quaternary ammonia? Is it an unapproved bleach for sanitizer, or is it just sanitizer? Make your selections now. I'll give you a few seconds. All right, hopefully you've made your selection, and we'll see what the results are. So congratulations, 54% of you picked the right answer. This is an unapproved bleach for a sanitizer. We presented this last year as well, and I think this topic was the most controversial, and we had the most questions about it last year. So I'll go into a little bit more detail about why it's an unapproved sanitizer. So not all bleaches are equal. So this is something that we explain to our restaurants, and I think a lot of people don't really understand. I think bleach has become synonymous with kills germs, and that is actually really not the case at all. If you go like down your Walmart or your Target aisle, right, and you look at your bleaches, almost all of them say cleans and deodorizes. It says nothing about killing germs whatsoever on that labeling. And so the FDA food code does state that all of your sanitizers have to follow EPA registered use label instructions. And not all these bleaches are EPA registered. Last time, I think this caused a little bit of confusion. So the EPA historically, at one point in time, the FDA did regulate bleaches. And then that was turned over to the EPA because bleach is considered a pesticide. That is why it is a EPA registration, registered label, and it has those use instructions on it. Now, these label instructions may not say anything about food contact surfaces on them. So if it doesn't, that would not be approved for use on food contact surfaces. When you're doing your inspections, you want to look for the EPA registration number. I put a picture of what that label looks like in the presentation. It is very small and often very difficult to find. I always tell people to also look for wording. If it says kills 99% of germs or something about killing germs or germicidal, that sort of thing, that labeling cannot be used unless it is an EPA registration. We have found within the last year, however, that some bleaches do say kills 99% of germs, but when you look at the use instructions on the back of the label, it'll actually say do not use on food contact surfaces. So you may run into one that is EPA registered, but that instruction says do not use it on food contact surfaces. So you need to follow those instructions. And the reason that this exists is because not all bleaches have the same percentage of that sodium hypochlorite in it. So sometimes that's why it's not registered. The company also has to provide data showing that that bleach will kill certain types of bacteria and viruses. And if they just have not provided that data to the EPA, it also is not registered. Or some bleaches, like scented bleaches or the splashless bleaches especially, contain other chemicals in the bleach that are not safe for food contact surfaces. So that's why it's important that you always look at the labeling. And one big thing I think that people are confused about last year is that these bleaches will still test fine on your test strips. So you can't just say, oh, it tested fine on test strips, so it's okay to use. You really do have to look at that label. All right, so let's move on to the next one. Get your fingers ready for that poll. What is this? Is this a maple syrup boiler, a tortilla press? Is it an industrial size fryer? Or is it a big soup kettle? All right, hopefully you've registered your guess. We'll see what we have. So the majority of you are also correct on this. It is a maple syrup boiler. And if you have ever been able to inspect this process, it smells amazing when they're doing this. I like to do these inspections, and my husband also has a friend who does it at his house. So we're usually involved in that process as well. So it smells pretty good. Again, this may be something that your jurisdiction does not regulate. In the state of Illinois, we do regulate this because it is done at the retail level. So the collection of the sap itself to make that maple syrup is a harvesting process. So we don't really regulate that part of it. It's amazing if you ever get to see it. I know our park district is actually where that picture is taken from. They make their own maple syrup and they sell it as fundraising for the park district. But they actually string these like tubing from tree to tree to tree to tree down a hillside. And then they actually vacuum the sap out of the trees into like a little sap house, and then they pump it up to their kitchen where they make the syrup itself. So sometimes you just have to be careful. Some maple syrup boilers are homemade. So the one in the picture was homemade. They had a guy who's just really into this at our park district, and he made this himself. And so if you are allowing somebody to make their own, you really just have to be careful that the materials that they're using are safe, durable, non-absorbent, smooth, easily cleanable, and resistant to chipping, pitting, and scratching. Those are food code requirements. This particular establishment also wanted to use copper in some of his equipment. We had to do a little bit of research because copper can only be used in certain pHs, and the sap of the tree has a very widely variable pH, and it was right around 6. And so we decided not to let him use copper because you don't want the syrup to cause leaching of the copper into that final product, and that could cause some poisoning issues. Another thing to keep in mind, many maple syrup boilers use wood as a heat source, and this is something to keep in mind anytime you have wood as a heat source. You know, in our county, we have like those pizza ovens that have wood. We've got people doing barbecue using wood. And so they really need to get wood from an approved source. It has to be untreated and free of chemicals, right? We don't want people sticking like their old used plywood from tearing down their house or something as a food in their food. And you also have to keep in mind that maple syrup production, it creates a lot of steam. Like I have never seen as much steam as what comes off of their boiler. They actually have ventilation above the unit itself. They have ventilation and they have a huge hood in their kitchen. And all of their windows and doors have screens on them so they can open them when they are doing this production. And it still creates so much steam in that kitchen. So if you ever are looking at plans for something like this, there is going to be much more ventilation required than what you might think is going to be required. All right, let's move on to the next one. What is it? Is this a microwave filter, a bamboo floor mat, a window blind, or a makisu? All right, we'll pull up that poll and take your best guess. All right, hopefully you've made your selection. And we'll see what we answered. So again, most of you have probably seen these before during your inspection. 74% of you guessed correctly. This is a makisu. So let's talk about it. This is something that it's a piece of equipment, and it's a piece of equipment that is used to roll certain types of sushi called maki. So you're really only going to see it in sushi food establishments. Their traditional makisu is made of bamboo and cotton string. And so obviously there are some food safety concerns because of the materials that are being used, as well as the cleanability of that mat. So how you kind of get around this is that piece of equipment has to be wrapped in plastic wrap to make a smooth, easily cleanable surface. And that plastic wrap has to be changed every 4 hours, or you want to store it in the refrigerator when you're not using it, so it doesn't grow bacteria on that food contact surface. And if I always feel like sushi scares people. If you want some sushi training, I actually do have a PowerPoint that I put together for our staff, and I've presented it at the state level about sushi. So at the end, there'll be my email. Just email me, and I will send that to you. And it goes over some of the different equipment and the hazards associated with sushi and how to inspect it. So feel free, email me at the end. I will send it out to you. All right, so what is this? Is this a roaster, a vertical broiler, an upright steam table, or a grease interceptor? Take your best guess. And for our Southwest friends, I learned last year that there is a different name that you guys use for this. So we'll talk about that too once you make your selection. All right, hopefully you have made your selection. So the majority of you, again, you've probably seen these, 77% pick the right answer. It is a vertical broiler, or as our friends in the Southwest say, I think it's a trompo. They just typed it. I did not hear anyone pronounce it. So I could be very wrong in that pronunciation of it. But I had never heard that word before. So again, there are some food safety challenges with one of these units. A vertical broiler is a type of cooking device. It slowly cooks the meat on a vertical rod, which is called a spit. That spit rotates, and the outside of the meat is cooked, right? There's usually these little flames, and the outside is cooked as the meat spins on that spit. And the establishment is then continually trimming off that cooked meat. The most common food items that I have seen cooked here in the Midwest are gyro meat and shawarma meat. However, I do believe there are different types of tacos, like taco meat that is made on these spits as well. And so when you have a vertical broiler, you really want to use a continuous cooking process. One thing that we had some issues with at one point in time was intermittent cooking, where our food establishments were turning the spit off or the heat source off, right? So they were not busy in the afternoon, they had no customers, and they just turned it off and left it sitting there. And when a customer came in, they turned it back on and they cooked that outside again. And we really don't want to do that, right? Because that allows the meat to stay in the temperature danger zone for an extended period of time. We want them to be, even if they're slow and they don't have customers, it should continuously be cooking and they should be shaving off that meat and hot holding it. I also want you to pay special attention if you are seeing frozen gyro cones being used on these vertical broilers. This is a pretty unique cooking process because the gyro meat is both very slowly thawing and cooking. And the middle of that gyro cone is going to be in the temperature danger zone for a really long time. And so like our jurisdiction, we require that if they're using a frozen gyro cone, that they cook that entire cone and slice it within 4 hours. And if they have the leftover slices, they can cool that down. But after that 4 hours, we do not allow them to wrap that gyro cone back up and refreeze it for the next day. So we encourage them to buy smaller cones if they're not going through the whole thing, or again, using that already shaved meat for the next day and cooling down those much smaller, thinner slices. All right, next one. What is this? Are these kosher certification symbols, underwriters laboratory symbols, cereal brand symbols, or made in England symbols? Take your best guess. All right. Oh, we gotta get that poll up. Yep. Thank you. Again, are these kosher certification symbols, underwriters laboratory symbols, cereal brand symbols, or made in England symbols? All right. So fantastic. 61% of you guessed correctly. They are kosher certification symbols. So let's talk a little bit about kosher. So we are lucky enough in my jurisdiction that we have a rabbi that we work with who actually certifies factories to be kosher. And he does education with us anytime we ask him to. And so this is taken directly from some of the education that he has provided to us. So what is kosher? The kosher laws define the foods are fit for consumption by a Jew. That's what kosher means. And for a food to be considered kosher, it has to be made from both kosher ingredients and with kosher equipment. And there are different types of ingredients, some that are inherently kosher, inherently not kosher, and then certified kosher, which is about the preparation being done under kosher protocol. And so one of the big things that I want you to take away from kosher food, if you are inspecting a food establishment that has kosher food, is that all equipment that comes in contact with kosher food must also be kosher. And you could actually ruin, and I think I made this word up, the kosherness of the food with your equipment. So I know like my food thermometer, even though you sanitize it between uses, I've taken temperatures of all sorts of things, right? Including things that are considered inherently not kosher, like pork. And so because of that, my thermometer would not be considered kosher. And if I put my thermometer in the kosher food, it would make that food not be kosher. So I just want you to, if you are seeing these symbols being used, right? Or if you see advertisements that food is kosher, I want you to stop and think about what you could possibly be doing to that food and ask the person in charge questions. Ask them, would you prefer that I use your thermometer to take the temperatures of these foods? And maybe it's a great opportunity to educate them about how to calibrate their thermometer and calibrate it for them and then use it to take the temperatures of the food. So anytime you're not sure, I'm a big advocate of asking, and most people, most food establishments are more than happy to share different parts of their culture with you and to educate you. And I think you become a better inspector because of that. And one question we had last year was, is halal and kosher the same thing? They are not the same thing, but they are similar. However, if you are inspecting a halal food establishment, I also want you to do the same thing. I want you to talk to the person in charge and ask them questions before you just start sticking your thermometer in everything that they have. That's the best way to build a relationship with them and to, again, educate yourself about their culture. All right, we've got a couple food items here. What is this? Is it samosas, biryani, chicken masala? Is it pad thai, curry, and tom yum? Is it pierogi, borscht, or bagos? Or is it hummus, falafel, and tabbouleh? Make your selection now. I saw somebody put in the chat, it's all good stuff. I agree with you. Some of these are my favorite food items, so. All right, so most of you guessed correctly again. 84% of you said hummus, falafel, and tabbouleh, which make up some really delicious Mediterranean foods, which again are my favorite types of foods. And so again, they're associated with Mediterranean and Middle Eastern cuisines. So something unique about these food items is that traditionally they are served at room temperature. However, they're also TCS foods, unless there's lab testing proving otherwise. And so you really have to think about the food safety and the culture of that food when you're making determinations about how to help your food establishments. And so time only as a control is a great food safety method that allows them to serve these food items traditionally at room temperature while also maintaining good food safety standards. So it's something to keep in mind is that oftentimes there are different cultural foods that are served at room temperature, but they will grow bacteria on them. And so, you know, if cultural foods are new to you as an inspector, and there's so many different cultures out there that those food items or the processing going behind how to make those food items may be very new to you, or it could be equipment that you've never seen before. There are resources out there to help you learn about these different cuisines. There is an AFTA resource page, which is fantastic. And there's also the Tennessee Integrated Food Safety Centers of Excellence Cultural Food Safety app, which can help you out as well. All right, I think this is our last one here. What is this? Is this an unapproved source? Is it red snapper for sushi? Is it frozen tilapia for sushi? Or is this food fraud? Make your selection now. All right, hopefully you've had enough time to make your selection. And we'll see what our results are. So the majority of you picked it's frozen tilapia for sushi or food fraud, and I will accept either one of these. So if you pick food fraud, you know where I'm going with this. This is something that has come up recently in our jurisdiction. So when you are doing a sushi inspection, all raw fish has to be frozen to specific time or temperatures. They has to be exempt from parasite destruction, like different types of tuna are, or it has to be aquacultured with certain conditions. And the establishment has to have written records that those fish that are aquacultured have been raised in those conditions. So you have to have a letter of guarantee from your supplier, a receipt saying that the fish is aquacultured. There could be labeling on the box the fish comes in, that sort of thing. So again, this is something that's come up recently in our jurisdiction. I was training one of our new hires in sushi, and we were looking at the menu and we were comparing the menu to the letters of guarantee that the establishment had on site. And they had red snapper on their menu. This is actually a screenshot of their menu. It says, I don't know how to pronounce this. I say Thai. I don't know if that's correct. Red snapper sushi. They had no records of ever receiving red snapper. And we actually had to call their fish supplier about this. And they said, we don't supply red snapper, we supply tilapia, which they were able to provide records for. However, that menu does not say tilapia. It says red snapper on it. So tilapia and red snapper, they are not the same fish. The restaurant tried to convince us it was the same fish. They are not the same fish. One is much more expensive than the other. So it is a type of food fraud. If you find something like that where, you know, they are selling one type of thing and calling it something else, it is a type of food fraud. So it's just a reminder to always check your menu and compare it to your on-site records when you're doing sushi inspections. So we kind of thought this is a one-off thing, right? Or like, okay, this is a one-time thing. We then conducted inspections of our 6 other sushi restaurants that had red snapper. All 6 of them, it was the same thing. They were selling tilapia instead of red snapper. So I do think that this is quite a bit more common than what we think it is. And again, it was only our sushi establishments that were actually selling red snapper, that it was tilapia. So we actually made them take it off the menu. And we said you can put it on there as tilapia. I don't know if anyone orders tilapia sushi or not, but it is there for them to order if they want. Let's see here. I know somebody said, can I show that picture again? So this is the sushi grade tilapia right there. And it looks a lot like red snapper, which is how they kind of get away with it. All right, so that's the end of our game. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A or in the chat. And I don't think I have any time to answer them, but I know that I will answer them, and it'll be put onto the event page after today is over with. If you have any questions or you want to contact me directly, if you want that sushi presentation, please email me. I will get it to you. I also, if you're interested in apple cider, I have a similar one for apple cider production and the hazards associated with apple cider, what you need to look for as an inspector, and that sort of thing. So if you're interested in either one of those, please shoot me an email. All right, thank you guys.
Thank you, Kareem. Greatly appreciate it. That was very fun. I learned a lot there as well, and I'm sure all of our attendees learned a lot and had fun answering those questions. Got to see some things you don't normally see in your regular inspections. So thank you so much. We greatly appreciate that. And now we're going to move into our break period. So we have about a 10-minute break. So if everybody will can step up, stand up, stretch, step away for a few minutes. We'll be back in 10 minutes. So we'll be back at 20 past the current hour. Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. I hope everyone had a chance to take a break for a few minutes, and welcome back to our third presentation for today's session. We will be having presenters for defining, identifying, and evaluating HACCP. I want to introduce our three speakers that we have for today for this session. We have Tom Nerney with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration Retail Food Specialist, Carrie Pahoya, Food Specialist, Advanced Division for Food and Recreational Safety with the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection, and Tara Edwards, Senior Environmental Health Specialist with Southern Nevada Health District. And we have more extensive information about their backgrounds in our boot camp website where you register. So if you want to learn more about their background and their credentials, we can see that there. So I will turn that over to our speakers for our next topic.
Thank you, Matt. It's great to see you again. I was just down in South Carolina last month visiting
good to
with
see
Matt.
you.
I think our presentation is supposed to be loaded for us, so hopefully we can get that up and running. But while that's happening, I want to thank AFTO too for making this training opportunity available to so many people. It's really impressive, and I thank them for inviting me back once again to boot camp. Happy to be one of the drill sergeants here today. I don't know if we still have technical difficulty, or here we go. Amy's gonna save the day again. There it is. Now if I can take control. All right. It looks like whoops. Let me see if I can go back. All right. Looks like we're up and running here. So this presentation is all about HACCP plans, how to evaluate them, especially in the field. But before we get into that part, we thought we'd start out by discussing some of the food code provisions that require HACCP plans. So I'll start with section 350211, which requires both a HACCP plan and a variance for the following specialized processing methods. The first is smoking food for preservation, not for flavor, obviously. So we're not talking about things like barbecue or wood-grilled pizza. We're talking more about items like cold smoked fish, for example. Curing foods, which typically utilizes a curing salt or a prog powder, it's called, which contains sodium nitrate. Sometimes it's called pink curing salt, and it's colored pink because it contains sodium nitrate. And we don't want that to be confused with typical table salt. If it's used in too high a concentration, it can be toxic. It can cause sodium nitrate poisoning. So it's really important that controls be in place to ensure that it's used at the appropriate levels. If you're interested, by the way, why it's called prog powder, that's where sodium nitrate was first used as a food preservative. Using food additives or adding components such as vinegar, either as a method of food preservation, so we're talking about acidifying vegetables, for example, or to render a food non-TCS. And I think probably the most common example we see of this at retail is sushi rice. We take cooked rice, which is a TCS food, add vinegar to drop the pH to the point where it's shelf stable and can be held out at room temperature. Operating molluscan shellfish display tanks. Molluscan shellfish are filter feeders, as you all know, and they can concentrate all different types of pathogens. So it's really important that the water is properly filtered and treated, and that the commingling of different species of shellfish or fish that are harvested from different growing areas doesn't occur. And I've seen a number of these display tanks pop up recently, actually, throughout the Northeast. And actually, they really weren't functioning as they should have, and they weren't treating the water properly. So try and keep your eye out for these molluscan shellfish display tanks. Custom processing of animals for personal use. So here we're talking about animals that are harvested in the wild, or maybe they're raised on a family farm, and they're brought into a retail establishment for butchering. Really, it's really important that when these animals are butchered, that the retail processing environment isn't contaminated, and that the meat that's results from the butchering is kind of identified and segregated and doesn't get mixed up with meats that are to be served to the general population. Sprouting seeds or beans. I'm sure you're all familiar with the outbreaks we've had associated with sprouts. The reason for that is that the seeds come in, they're a raw agricultural commodity. They can already be contaminated with things like salmonella or E. coli. And once the seed starts to sprout, nutrients become available to these bacteria and they can grow to dangerous levels. So it's very important that both the seeds are treated before they're sprouted and that the sprouting environment is kept clean and sanitary. We couldn't possibly, think of all the different processing methods that industry could come up with. So there's a catch-all in this provision as well that states that any method determined by the regulatory authority to require a variance will require both a variance and a HACCP plan. And so if the regulatory authority determines that additional controls are necessary to protect public health, they can require one for any process at any time. And finally, a HACCP plan and variance are required for ROP processing methods. There is an exception to this under 350212, and I'll discuss that in just a bit. But before we get into that, I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about what reduced oxygen packaging is and what it means. So ROP is a defined term in the code, and it is the reduction of the amount of oxygen in a package, either by removing the oxygen, displacing and replacing the oxygen with gas or the gases, or otherwise controlling the amount of oxygen in a package so that it's less than what's normally found at sea level, which is 21%. And it involves foods for which the hazards of CBOT and L mono require control in the final package form. So we're not talking about, non-TCS foods here, for example, dried coffee beans or what have you. And there are 5 distinct ROP methods also included in the definition of ROP in the food code, and I'll talk about each of them individually here. The first is vacuum packaging. Here, air is removed from the package, and the package is hermetically sealed so that the vacuum remains inside that package. And we see basically 2 different types of processing equipment for this. The first we call a chamber type vacuum packaging machine, and that is depicted in the top 2 pictures here. Here, food is placed in a plastic pouch. The entire pouch is placed inside of the chamber. And the opening of the pouch is placed across this heat bar. And there's a heat bar on the bottom of the chamber, and there's one also on the inside of the chamber door up top. Chamber door is closed. Vacuum pump is activated. It draws all the air, or a good portion of the air, out of that chamber. The heat bar is then activated, seals the package closed, hermetically seals it. Door opens, and the process is really that simple. There are controls where they can set the amount of time that the vacuum pump will run, and that can sort of control how much air is evacuated from the chamber. There's certain products, chefs will want certain products to receive different amounts of vacuum based on, however the food product may be affected by the vacuum. These are very heavy. They're difficult to hide. They're pretty easy to spot in a retail establishment. Those vacuum pumps weigh an awful lot. So this equipment, it's either pretty much stationary, it's kept in one place, or you'll find it on a cart maybe where it gets moved in and out when they're processing. The other type of equipment we'll see are what I refer to anyway as a home type vacuum packaging machine. Unlike the chamber type, these are really lightweight. They function pretty much the same way. Food product is placed in a package or pouch. The opening to the pouch is placed inside a very small chamber. There's a heat bar there as well. Chamber's closed, pump pulls the vacuum, heat bar is activated, and it fuses the opening of the package together. Again, these are a lot more difficult to spot in a retail establishment, it's good to ask questions about whether or not they have this type of equipment. But if you see this, or you see vacuum packaged food that's not labeled, or that has, like, I don't know, maybe it's labeled with a Sharpie, you'll want to ask questions about reduced oxygen packaging. Or if you see these bags, you may see pouches around that are used for ROP packaging. Two other types of ROP are modified atmosphere packaging, or what we call MAP, or controlled atmosphere packaging, or CAP. Both of these are similar types of processing methods. Here, food is placed in a bag, or more often in a tray. The package is flushed with gas. Usually, two types of gases are used. You see CO2 and nitrogen most often. And then the package is sealed so that the atmosphere within the bag contains less oxygen than what's typically found at sea level. The difference between the two is that with MAP, the atmosphere within that package can change over time. And there are two reasons for that. The first is the permeability of the packaging. So most films that are used in packaging allow oxygen to transfer into the package, and we call this the oxygen transfer rate. So the higher the oxygen transfer rate, the more oxygen can enter the package at a faster rate. So in this case, we could see an increase of oxygen over time as the food is held. The other factor is the respiration of food. And so foods that contain living cells, like raw plant food, for example, those cells need to create energy, and they continue to create energy even during storage. And they do that by consuming oxygen. There's a biological process where oxygen is consumed, and the waste product from that is CO2 and H2O. So one of the reasons MAP is so popular is that if you reduce the amount of oxygen available to those cells, you can actually slow down respiration, and you get a much longer shelf life. The food looks fresher, and it is fresher over time. CAP, on the other hand, same process, only here, the atmosphere is continuously controlled. It remains stable, static over time. This is accomplished in one of two ways as well. The first is by using what they call oxygen scavengers. And there's a whole bunch of different types of oxygen scavengers used. The one I wrap my head around most easily, and one that's very common, is simple iron filings in sodium, which could be in a little pouch. And these are used kind of with higher moisture foods. Here in New England, we know by looking at our cars, if you have salt and you have moisture and you have iron, the only thing you need is oxygen, and we'll see oxidation. So the iron will rust, right? So as oxygen permeates the membrane of the packaging and becomes available within that environment, oxidation will occur, which consumes the oxygen. So it'll keep it at a fairly stable rate. The other method is a combination of total oxygen replacement. So all the oxygen is removed from a package. The use of non-respiring food. So the food itself won't change the internal amount of oxygen, and the use of impermeable packaging. So oxygen can't penetrate through the packaging material. This is kind of typical MAP equipment. This is a fairly large machine. You can see in the top picture here. I kind of broke this down into three different shots on the bottom. The first one on the left, you can see food is placed in these plastic trays. It's carried via conveyor belt to this chamber. In the center picture here, that chamber is then flushed with gas, and an overlay film is placed on top and seals it shut. And then you can see the packaged food come out the right side of the machine here. These are often kind of like puffy. I'm sure you see this a lot, especially with like meats, like ground meat and whatnot, where they use these gases to prevent oxidation, right? Remove the oxygen, placed it with these gases. And they call that pillow pack when they're puffy like that. Here's some additional equipment. This machine on the left is just like the other one, just a smaller version. Still very easy to spot this equipment. You pretty much we'll always know when MAP is happening. If you see any canisters anywhere, ask questions about them if they're not hooked up, soda dispensing equipment or something like that. Ask questions about why they're there. You could have some MAP packaging being conducted. That chamber vacuum machine we talked about earlier, many of them can perform MAP packaging as well. Once the air is evacuated from that chamber, gas can then be flushed inside the chamber, and the package gets sealed shut with the gas inside the package. So many of those are capable of doing MAP packaging as well. Cook chill packaging is also very common at retail, usually I see it in larger restaurants, commissaries, or lots of it in institutional food service operations. With this process, cooked food is filled while it's hot, above 135 degrees, into impermeable bags, and the bags are sealed or crimped closed. Sometimes hot food is placed in plastic trays, and the trays are sealed with overwrap. In fact, in the supplement to the 2022 food code that just came out, we've actually changed the step definition. I need to update this slide. This just came out, and they've replaced the word bags with packaging to reflect the fact that bags aren't always used. It's typically what you'll see are bags. And in the photos here, you can see the food is cooked. It's placed into bags. In this case, it's being heat sealed shut. I may have some pictures somewhere else, or someone else may have photos in their presentation where they actually have crimping equipment to crimp a piece of wire around the opening of the bag. And when food is heated, oxygen is driven out of it. So when it's placed in a bag and the bag is sealed shut, that results in reduced oxygen environment. Once the bag is closed, it can be rapidly chilled and held cold. Sous vide is the final ROP method identified in the code. It's here we take raw food and we vacuum package it just like we discussed previously. The food's placed in a pouch, vacuum is pulled, it's sealed. Only here the raw food could be meat, poultry, vegetables, any combination of those items are then placed in a water bath. And you can see in our center picture here, there's a lucite container used. I see a lot of lucite containers like this used in sous vide, but the vessel can really be just about anything. I've seen large stock pots used. There's even big commercial, stainless steel commercial equipment that looks like a fryolator that can be used for sous vide cooking. And then at the back of this, you'll see what we call an immersion circulator. What this does is it heats the water to a desired temperature, holds it there, and it also circulates the water so that you get consistent, nice, even cooking. It stays at pretty much exactly the same temperature. And how this works is the immersion circulator is typically activated, brings the water up to temperature. A number of food products get loaded in the bath, and which drops the water temperature. The immersion circulator runs and runs and runs and circulates until it heats the food up to that desired temp. It'll then beep. The equipment will then identify the fact that the water's reached its cooking temp and a timer is started. And here on the right, you can see the immersion circulator out of the water bath. These immersion circulators come in all different shapes and sizes as well. I've seen some the size of like a small handheld flashlight. This is kind of a medium-sized one, I would say. But again, they come in all shapes and sizes. All right, so those are the 5 ROP methods identified in the code, but why are we concerned about foods that undergo reduced oxygen packaging? And the code tells us Listeria monocytogenes and Clostridium botulinum are the 2 hazards of primary concern. Listeria monocytogenes is a facultative anaerobe, so it'll grow in the presence of oxygen or in an anaerobic environment. One of the concerns is it grows at refrigerated temperatures. It'll grow all the way down to freezing temps, though the colder the cold holding temp is, the slower it grows. And it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's in the air, soil, water. It can be found in raw food products, animals. It is a very common resident pathogen in both manufacturing firms and retail establishments. Really tough to get get rid of it, to remove it from the environment once it's there. And it can cause serious illness, especially in the elderly, the young, anyone that's immunocompromised, organ transplants recipients, for example, and particularly dangerous to pregnant women and a fetus. Clostridium botulinum, the other one, you're all familiar with CBOT, I'm sure. It is an anaerobe, so it requires that reduced oxygen environment. There are certain types, non-proteolytic types, that will grow at typical refrigerated temperatures, low as 38 degrees Fahrenheit. And that type are typically found in marine and aquatic environments. So we're really concerned about fish in fish and fishery products that are held under anaerobic conditions, so in reduced oxygen packaging. The vegetative cells are relatively easy to kill with heat, so with typical cooking temperatures, but it's a spore former, and those spores are very heat resistant. They survive normal cooking temperatures, so specialized equipment like a retort is needed to inactivate spores. It also produces a neurotoxin, which is one of the deadliest naturally occurring substances known. So I'm sure you've all heard about the type of damage that botulism causes to the body. I certainly never want to experience that myself. All right. Now we reviewed what ROP is. We can talk about the food code requirements for ROP without a variance. This is covered under 3502.12. And if these provisions are followed exactly as written, a variance is not required. But a HACCP plan is, and it needs to be submitted to the regulatory authority prior to commencing operations. I'm going to focus on cook, chill, and sous vide, but I did want to make you aware that there are 3 other categories of food listed in this section for which there are regulations. The first are foods with two barriers. The first barrier would be refrigeration, and the second barrier could be any one of the following: a water activity of 0.91 or less, a pH of 4.6 or less. Either one of those are sufficient to control for CBOT. A meat or a poultry product that's cured at a food processing plant regulated by USDA. So most of these products contain preservatives like sodium nitrite we discussed earlier. Or foods with a high level of competing organisms such as raw meat, raw poultry, or raw vegetables. As you know, most pathogens they're poor competitors. So where there are a high level of competing organisms, they just won't do well. There are some additional requirements. Some SOPs are required for these foods, but if that provision of the code is followed exactly, one can get up to a 30-day shelf life for these types of food products. Cheeses, for which there's a standard of identity that are commercially manufactured in a food processing plant, and there are no added ingredients at the retail establishment, can also be packaged without a variance. Again, the HACCP plan is required. There are certain intrinsic inhibitory factors in cheeses that can allow for this. And again, cheeses can get up to 30 days. As we just mentioned a little while ago, there are certain types of CBOT found in marine and aquatic environments that can grow and produce toxin at typical refrigeration temperatures. And therefore, fish can be placed in ROP packaging without a variance, provided they're frozen before, during, and after packaging. Otherwise, a variance is always needed. And then we have the cook, chill, and sous vide section I'll spend a little bit of time discussing. All right, so cook, chill, and sous vide is under paragraph D of 3502.12. And again, the following excludes fish. Fish is always frozen before, during, and after. And as I mentioned, a HACCP plan needs to be submitted to the regulatory authority prior to commencing operation. And that HACCP plan needs to ensure that the food is prepared and consumed on the premises. It can be moved off the premises, provided it's moved to another location under control of the same business entity. So it can go from a commissary, for example, to a restaurant provided it's all part of the same business entity. So there are absolutely no sales to other businesses or sales directly to the consumer. These food products need to be cooked in accordance with the requirements in Chapter 3. So they have to be fully cooked. Many chefs that conduct sous vide have an issue with this because they really want to cook the foods for a longer period of time at a lower temperature, which is fine, but they need to apply for a variance if they want to do that. And I think we'll hear more about this in another presentation, so I won't talk too much about that. The foods need to be protected from contamination before and after cooking. This is especially important with cook chill, where there's an opportunity for post-thermal processing contamination, right? It's hot, it's going into a bag. It's potentially exposed to the environment before that package is sealed. And it needs to be placed in a package with an oxygen barrier and sealed immediately before cooking, in the case of sous vide, or placed in a package and sealed immediately after cooking and before reaching 135 degrees Fahrenheit, as is the case for cooked chill. Okay, the food needs to be properly cooled in accordance with the food code. So that's that 6-hour cooling window, provided it goes from 135 to 70 within that first 2 hours. And one thing I like about cooked chill and sous vide is the packages can be placed directly into an ice slurry, which I think really can facilitate rapid cooling, provided, you know, the ice slurry isn't overloaded with product and that the product is agitated regularly to, you know, to help with the cooling process. Once it's cooled, there are some options for cold storage. It can be held at 41 for up to 7 days, just like any other TCS food. And then it needs to be consumed or discarded. Or it can be cooled cooled to 34 degrees Fahrenheit, within 48 hours of reaching 41, in which case can be held at 34 degrees for up to 30 days. Or there's kind of a hybrid, right, where it's dropped down to 34 degrees Fahrenheit within that 48 hours. It's held there for a certain amount of time. It can then be brought back up to 41 degrees storage and held for up to 7 days, provided the entire time it's in that ROP package doesn't exceed 30 days. So if it's held at 34 degrees and we're on day 25 and it's then moved to 41 degrees storage, there are only 5 days remaining before that product needs to be sold or served or disposed. And of course, it can be held frozen with no shelf life restrictions. Okay, remember, refrigeration is the sole barrier to CBOT growth here. So it's really important that refrigeration unit is equipped with an electronic system that continuously monitors the time and the temperature, and that equipment is visually examined for proper operation twice daily. And remember, we said it could be transported, say, from a commissary to a restaurant under same ownership. If it is transported, then verifiable electronic monitoring needs to be conducted as well. Some other requirements: the food needs to be labeled with the product name and date that it was packaged. Cooling and cold holding records need to be maintained for up to 6 months, and they need to be made available to the regulatory authority for review on request. Some other operational procedures are also required. These are required for those other categories of foods I talked about earlier too. Procedures that prohibit bare hand contact with ready-to-eat foods. There needs to be a designated work area. So either a separate designated area or an area where this processing is taking place, but no other activity is going on at the time. So we say separation by time or space. Cleaning and sanitizing procedures also need to be documented. And a training program is essential, right? Employees performing these activities need to understand the hazards involved with the product and also need to understand how to properly operate the equipment. I mentioned earlier there was one exception to the requirement for a HACCP plan, and that's found under 3502.11, paragraph F. And it states that a HACCP plan is not required for ROP packaging methods to package TCS food that is always labeled with the production time and date, held at 41 degrees Fahrenheit or less during refrigerated storage, and removed from its package in the food establishment within 48 hours after packaging. So if a product goes into a bag on Tuesday at noon, it needs to be removed from that bag by Thursday at noon. And again, this is not for fish. I know I've said this like 5 times. Fish always has to be frozen before, during, and after. And you notice that fish is in capital letters. That's because it's a defined term in the food code. And it's important to understand that that doesn't just mean fin fish. It means all sorts of creatures that live in and around the water. So it's important to know what's included in that definition. I did have a photograph of some other things you might see associated with sous vide. The first is a roll of foam tape. So you might see some of this lying around. You want to ask questions. And the tape is designed to put on the outside of a package of food that's been vacuum packed. And then if you have a probe that's thin enough, you can pierce that package, go through the tape, pierce the package without destroying the vacuum. I've tried to use that. I haven't had much luck with it. Some other equipment you might see used to, both validate a HACCP system or to verify that it's working properly. Or I see some of these Bluetooth thermometers now. I don't know if you can see this picture on the upper right. There's a little probe sticking out of a package of food that was placed into a product before it was vacuum packaged, and that transmits a signal for both the ambient water temperature and the internal cooking temperature of that product, and it can be plotted out as you see in the lower right. I think you'll hear more about equipment 2 in a subsequent presentation. So I do have a few review questions to wrap up my piece of this presentation. I don't know if I'll be able to see that when it comes up, but I'm sure there's a way you'll be able to answer this. There it is. Okay, so with this type of ROP, cooked food is hot filled into impermeable bags that are then sealed or crimp closed. The bagged food is rapidly chilled and refrigerated. What type of ROP is this? And it, again, not necessarily in bags, could be in trays. Is it vacuum packaging, cooked, chill, sous vide, or cap? And our answer is, what do we answer? All right, almost everyone got that right. 78% said cook chill. That's good. When hot food is placed in the package, it's cook chill. Question 2. With this type of ROP method, air is removed from a package of food and the package is hermetically sealed so that a vacuum remains inside the package. Is that vacuum packaging, cook chill, sous vide, or modified atmosphere packaging? We're going to get 100 on this one. And almost 86%, I'll take it. That is vacuum packaging. Air is removed from the package, package is sealed. MAP would involve flushing with different gas or gases, right? Okay. Question 3. In this type of ROP packaging, raw or partially cooked food is vacuum packaged in an impermeable bag, cooked in the bag, rapidly chilled, and refrigerated. Is this vacuum packaging, cooked, chill, sous vide, or MAP, modified atmosphere packaging? And the answer is sous vide, right? Raw food or partially cooked food is placed in a bag. It's vacuum packaged and then it's cooked inside the bag in that water bath. All right. Retail establishments may use ROP methods on TCS foods without a variance if the provisions of 3502.12b are followed exactly as written, and it is a food with a high level of competing organisms, such as raw meat, raw poultry, raw vegetables, or raw fish. Oh, and I didn't change the slide, did I? Apologize for that. That was my fault. Tricky. I saw someone comment. Wow, we have a split here. Okay, for fish, a variance is always required unless the fish is frozen before, during, and after reduced oxygen packaging. So a variance would be required here. So that is false. Wow, that's exactly a 50-50. But that's why I included that question, to kind of reinforce the fact that fish needs to be frozen before, during, and after, or a variance is required. For preparation without a variance, cooked, chill, and sous vide products must be cooked according to time temperature as specified under 3401.11 A, B, and C, unless a consumer advisory is provided as detailed in 3603.11. True or false? This is tricky too. But this is advanced boot camp, so I'm gonna ask tricky questions. And again, we have a 50-50 split. I'm glad I asked these questions. So the provisions in 3502.12 have to be followed exactly, or a variance is required. So here it requires the food to be fully cooked in accordance with those provisions. Otherwise, a variance would be required. All right. That's all I have. I think I'll pass the baton on to our next speaker, and I'll be available and try to monitor chat for questions. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to me.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Tom gave us kind of the building blocks of HACCP and special processes and reduced oxygen packaging. So now I am going to talk about HACCP validation, review, and approval. In Wisconsin, we have a I'm going to close this out. We have a very interesting setup, which I think probably happens in some other states as well. So there's a team of 6 of us, and we are SMEs in special processes. So hopefully those of you who do not have that luxury, you're going to take back some information, and we're going to give you some starting points where you can at least find what you need to look for if you are validating a HACCP plan. Right. So just quickly in the chat, how many of you have had to validate? So there's a difference between validation and verification. Just say heck yeah, or raise your thumbs up. So I'm seeing some no's, some yeses. Yeah, so it looks like it's maybe 50-50-ish as to who is actually having to look at plans. All right. So HACCP plan basics. We all used to just squirm in my seat when I would hear somebody that wanted to do a special process. I did not even know where to start. I didn't know where to look. I didn't even know who to ask. So it's been a labor of love to kind of learn about special processes. So when we're talking about special processes and HACCP plans, you're going to see this a lot. The basics. This is the easy part. These are the things that they should provide when they are submitting their HACCP plan for that special process. You want to make sure they have that food flow, that they're walking through the steps of that product from the back door to service. With that food flow, they're going to have that accompanying hazard analysis. It's going to kind of go through each step of the process that is set forth in that food flow. They're going to have to identify critical control points from that hazard analysis. And with that could be critical limits. We're going to talk about different critical limits as well, because not all critical limits are going to be critical limits based on the food code. Also, really important, they're going to need those monitoring procedures, that who, what, when, how are they going to make sure they're addressing those critical limits and that food is being safe and it's kept under control, food safety wise. Before they even send you any of this, you really want to make sure they have SOPs, standard operating procedures, prerequisite programs addressed, that they have SSOPs, or those sanitary standard operating procedures, in place as well. So you have somebody that is talking about doing a special process and you get this food flow. Oh my gosh, what would you do? First of all, they've identified in the yellow blocks, those are all their critical control points. And I always tell people, they can identify every step in the process as a critical control point, but if they do that, they're going to have to set forth critical limits, monitoring, etc., verification. So what would you do? And just go ahead in the chat. Would you be like, oh my gosh, no, you can't do that? We have some inspectors that tell somebody that. They're like, no, we're just not going to allow you to do that. So they're sending you this food flow. This is their proposed process. They have receiving, cold storage, cooking, bagging, cooling, cold holding, receiving or reheating, hot holding, serving. All right, what is the difference between a critical control point and CP? I'm guessing, okay, delegate a potential CCP to SSLP, good manufacturing practices, get more info. Drill down to see what the critical control points actually are. And I'm seeing a lot of my Wisconsin folks answering in the chat, so thanks. They have a lot of record keeping to do. Yes, they do, Anna. So yeah, what would you do? I'd really sit down and probably have a conversation with them. Is this really their process? Do they really want to identify all of these points in the process as critical control points? And again, not all flow charts are going to look the same. So here are some other examples. So here you have a sous vide of pork. The one on the left, it's going to be, they're going to receive, they're going to store, they are going to prepare, package. Again, they're going to store that, and then they're going to cook it. And you can see, oh boy, this is not the normal cook temperature I'm used to, but they're proposing cooking to 131 for 97 minutes and holding it at that. How are they going to do that? Are they going to hold it and serve it? Or they may be having a process in place where it's going to kind of maybe separate out. So they're going to cook it and they're either going to serve it or they're going to cool it, store it, reheat it, hold it, and then serve it. So again, I always tell people, when you get those flow charts, when you get a HACCP plan, a hazard analysis, no two plans, no two flow charts are probably going to look the same. Here's another example. So they are proposing, they're going to receive, store, prepare Package, store, cook, hold, and serve. A lot of times we see a more descriptive kind of step through the process as well. So first we receive the product from the supplier. Then we store the product in our walk-in cooler. We prepare the product. We package the product in reduced oxygen packaging. We store the product in reduced oxygen packaging, and then we cook it. We're going to cook it. We're proposing 131 degrees Fahrenheit for 91 minutes. We're then going to hold the product in a steam table above 131, and then we serve it. So again, you can see how these all look slightly different, but they're giving you the same information. Again, the only thing I would like to see is probably some critical control points identified in these process flow charts. So, polling question. All right, first one of my little session. So we have a recipe on the left. They're going to make some marinara sauce. So we have some canned spaghetti sauce, ground beef, onions, garlic, Parmesan cheese, herbs, oregano, basil, sugar, red wine. And then there's the steps in the process. So they're going to add the ground beef to the steam kettle, cook until the meat reaches 155 degrees. They're going to drain that fat off. Add onions and garlic, saute, add spaghetti sauce, salt, herbs, sugars, red wine, cheese, stir. They're then going to heat that sauce to 190 degrees and simmer while stirring. They're going to portion into bags, seal the bags, place in an ice bath to cool, remove and place in the cooler, refrigerate and store, and reheat and serve. All right, that's a lot. So which of the following is a primary concern, a hazard of concern for this process? Salmonella, Bacillus cereus, or Clostridium botulinum? Three choices. You have 1/3 of a chance, 33% chance of being correct. All right. Let's see what everyone said, Amy. So, all right. So 67% of you said CBOT, Clostridium botulinum, and ta-da, that is correct. When we think of reduced oxygen packaging, because they're going to hot fill these bags, it's going to drive out that oxygen. They're then going to cool it. We're concerned with botulism, Clostridium botulinum, because it loves those anaerobic environments. All right. So now going through that same process, what steps would you want that operator, person in charge, to identify as critical control points? There's only one choice. So steps 1 and 4, steps 6 and 9, or steps 4 and 7. I wish I had some Jeopardy music. Na, 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 na. All right. So which steps? Okay, so it looks like roughly 46% of you said step 4 and 7. That is correct. Steps 4, they're going to heat it to 190 degrees. And step 7, they're going to place in an ice bath to cool. So when we're thinking of that, that's going to be that heat. They're going to apply that heat to control pathogens, and then they're going to cool. And we want to make sure they're cooling quickly, and you're going to typically see this happening in that ice bath slurry to ensure that it's going to meet 41 degrees or less in the 6 hours. Okay. So now I'm just going to go through an example of sous vide. I'm going to tell you, we typically see in Wisconsin not a heck of a lot of sous vide. We see more just run-of-the-mill, reduced oxygen packaging of meat, of cooked food, some frozen fish. In fact, about 1/3 of our submissions are reduced oxygen packaging, and probably 1/3 of that, maybe 10% are going to be sous vide. Sous vide ebbs and flows, I feel like. It just depends if there's a deal on equipment. But it is kind of a little different when we think about that, because you might be seeing some different documentation science that would be used for sous vide. So let's talk about an example. So first off, again, I want to remind everybody, this is not an all-encompassing submission of sous vide. There's going to be some other things that we're going to want to see when they submit the HACCP plan and all of their supporting documents. Okay, so here we have our flow chart. So we can see we're going to receive our raw meats and poultry, and we're going to receive those dry storage things, packaging, spices, etc. So that raw meat and poultry is going to be held in cold storage, and then those shelf stable, room temperature kind of products are going to be held probably in the pantry. Where it's going to come together is during that preparation. So we're going to combine the raw meats or poultry and maybe with some seasonings, and we're going to package them. So from there, we're going to package and then we're going to cook. So you can see that cooking is going to be our first critical control point. Next, step number 7, we're going to cool it, which is identified as critical control point number 2. After it's cooled, they're going to label it. And labeling is really important because we want to make sure that the product is properly rotated. You might see that they're going to label afterwards because the label might not stick when it's really hot. Finally, we're going to do the cold storage. Again, critical control point at that step in the process. That's going to be our CCP number 3. And then we're going to reheat it. And finally, we're going to serve it. So we have our flow chart. We've identified the critical control points in that flow chart. So next, we're going to go to a hazard analysis. And I'm going to apologize. I know this is pretty busy, but here you can see in the flow chart where all of the steps from the flow chart are addressed in the hazard analysis. So from there, you're going to identify if there's biological, chemical, or physical concerns. If those are addressed, you're going to figure out what those concerns, like for example, if it's a biological, most likely it's going to be Clostridium botulinum, Listeria. For cooking, you may see Salmonella. So again, they're going to identify in those steps in the process, what are the CCPs and what are the physical, biological, and chemical concerns. So from that hazard analysis, we then look at the HACCP plan. So this is actually the HACCP plan. We've taken those 3 identified critical control points in that process of sous vide a product, and we are now looking at those specific critical control points that we've identified. And so from that, we have the pathogens. So that our hazard description is going to be pathogens, of course, for each of those steps for the cooking, cooling, and cold storage. We've also identified the critical limits. So here you can see critical limits for beef, so 130 degrees for 112 minutes, pork 130 for 112 minutes, or poultry 165 degrees for 15 seconds. Again, when we look at cooling, they're going to follow the food code cooling parameters, so 135 to 70 in 2 hours. And then we want to get down to that 41 from 135 in no more than 6 hours. A lot of times people will just say 4 hours to get from 70 to 41 or below. And of course, our cold storage, we want to make sure that the product is kept at 41 or below in no more than 7 days. So that's kind of where that labeling comes into place as well. It's really important when we're looking at the HACCP form to make sure They're honing in on that monitoring. So again, like I said, the what, how, frequency, who. So how is that product going to be monitored? What is going to be monitored, how it's going to be monitored, the frequency at what it's going to be monitored, and again, who's going to do that. A lot of times we might see where people are going to be very specific on the who. I like this when it's a designated food worker. We just want to make sure that food worker has knowledge of the HACCP plan and reduce oxygen packaging and the hazards of concern. But again, you want to make sure in that monitoring is so extremely important that they're identifying the what, the how, the frequency, the who. And I'm going to tell you, if somebody is proposing a frequency of, oh, once a month, we're going to monitor a batch of our sous vide product, I'd probably be like, no, we need some more frequent monitoring. Probably during every batch, we want to see that monitoring taking place. Along with that, corrective actions. So corrective actions, what's going to happen if that critical limit's not met? We've seen some very vague corrective actions as well. Again, they need to be specific in that corrective action, what they're going to do, and then how is that going to be controlled? Usually with that corrective action, you also want to see maybe some, if it's an employee issue, some retraining of employees that are involved with the HACCP plan. Verification activities. This is kind of somewhat forgotten about, but somebody, so this is different than you verifying. This is actually an internal verification of the HACCP plan. So hopefully there's someone, the owner, the manager, the district rep, anybody that is then going in and frequently verifying that the staff are doing what is being proposed in the HACCP plan and that it's being followed. And they should be signing off on that in some way, shape, or form. So of course, you can see here just under the cooking. So we have cooking log reviewed daily by the chef, thermometer validation log reviewed by chef, it looks like biannually. So again, are they reviewing it? How are they documenting that they're reviewing it? You want to make sure there's some verification activities addressed as well. And finally, record keeping procedures. They have to have some sort of records, some sort of documentation that they're completing to show that they're doing the monitoring. So when they're submitting this plan, you are going to also want to see examples of these logs. So we have a cooking log, a thermometer validation log, a cooling log, we have our refrigeration log. I will also say you're probably going to want to see some sort of training logs, training records, and a corrective action log as well. All right. So, poll question. Let's bring up the question at hand here. We have somebody that has provided this flow chart. Could you approve a HACCP plan with this food flow chart? Yes or no? 50-50 chance. And my wizard behind the curtain is monitoring. So let's see what we came up with. False. That is correct. We want to make sure that the storage label is a CCP and that is missing. I would highly encourage you to not approve a plan if there are missing CCPs. We want to make sure that storage and labeling of the product is a critical control point because it's crucial that they hold that product as prescribed in the food code. So for an example, 41 degrees or less for no more than 7 days. All right. So what is validation? What are we talking about? What is validation? So we want to make sure when you're validating a HACCP plan that it's going to control hazards and that it's designed to do so. So the validation beforehand is going to be completed by the operator. Sometimes it's done informally. The operator has validated once they have turned it in. And then there's going to be that completion by the regulator. So the regulator, that's going to be you, is either going to agree or disagree with the operator's validation. There's a lot of information and science out there for already validated HACCP plans or validated processes. I'm going to talk about one at the end that is really beneficial in helping. So validation is, I always say, it's the desk work. You're getting in that plan. You are looking at all of the documentation. You're looking at the HACCP plan itself. You're making sure they're addressing the monitoring, the verification, the record keeping, that they have appropriate critical limits, and that they're using proper equipment, so on and so forth. So again, that validation is that desk review. You're validating to make sure that that process is safe. So when we're talking about reduced oxygen packaging, there are some considerations when we're validating that HACCP plan. As Tom said, compliance with the food code under 3-50212. They need to follow time temperature requirements. We want to make sure they're addressing, if there's a sous vide, that they're addressing final cook temperatures. Remember, a cook chill or a sous vide product cannot be sold in the package to the customer. They cannot cook chill a spaghetti sauce or marinara sauce or sous vide a chicken breast and sell it in the package to the consumer. It has to be sold in unpackaged form. And we also want to make sure that if they are going to reduce oxygen package something like a raw meat or fish that's frozen, they meet the labeling requirements as well. Also, we did have the question, what if they don't, if it's a cooked product and it's not a cooked chill or a sous vide? It might be one of those situations where they're going to have to submit that variance application to you as well. Also, you want to keep in mind, is additional science being used? Is that additional science going to achieve equivalent lethality to the food code? I'll talk a little bit about that. Are there alternate monitoring procedures? Again, we'll talk about that as well. So these are some things you have to remember when you're validating that HACCP plan, specifically for reduced oxygen packaging. So when we're talking about monitoring and equivalent lethality, there are some things here to consider. You may see somebody using something like FSIS Appendix A. So again, if they're proposing using FSIS Appendix A, this will not reach food code cook temperatures, but USDA has shown that this will achieve either a 6.5 log reduction or 7 log reduction of pathogens of concern. So if they are not meeting 3-50212, they're going to need to submit a variance. So just remember, if it's not meeting what's prescribed in Chapter 3, this could be a situation for a variance as well. There are commonly used alternate validations, and that operator is going to need to monitor both time and temperature when we're talking about equivalent lethality. And so when you see this, it's kind of like the roast cooking. There's not going to be that instantaneous cooking temperature like the food code cooking temperatures. When we talk about poultry at 165 degrees Fahrenheit, they might be proposing something else where they're going to hold it at this temperature for a certain amount of time. as I promised, and we're also going to include the link in chat, which Christina did. Thank you very much, Christina. This is a popular one where people are going to use FSIS Appendix A. You can see here, this is typically what we see, and you can see now the food code has actually been updated to include these as well. So 145 degrees for 4 minutes. Again, how are they going to monitor that and hold it and make sure that they're meeting that lethality for that specified amount of time? So there are some other things to consider as well. But again, we like to share this. Typically, I see a lot of FSIS Appendix A when it comes to cooking, especially sous vide. They like to use this. I think they feel like it gives them a better product, kind of that low and slow type cooking. So what about monitoring procedures? And we talked about monitoring procedures and maybe using some alternatives. And this is actually, the pictures here are pictures of a place that I was actually doing a HACCP plan verification, which Tara's going to talk about, where they were using sous vide to cook their chicken breasts. The chicken breasts, I guess, are absolutely amazing. So when we're talking about validated monitoring procedures, there are other monitoring methods that exist. Internal temperatures, that's the easy button. That's the easy button to monitor internal temperatures. As we know, equipment can be very expensive, and Tom talked about maybe Bluetooth thermometers or the different types of tapes that you might see. That's a possibility. You might see that. And I always tell people, if you see something and you don't know what it is, don't be afraid to ask. But again, the internal temperature is the easy button. There are other options out there as well. And we're going to talk about those other validated methods. So when we're talking about another validated method, here you can see where instead of the internal temperature, there is science out there in the sous vide cooking, a review in International Journal of Gastronomy and Food Science. So using this, they're going to measure the thickness instead of internal temperatures. And it also provides that come up time. So we want to make sure that they're reaching that come up time for that thickness of product. And if it's we always want to go with worst case scenario. So if they're going to do this by measuring the thickness and using the thickness, we want to make sure, worst case scenario, if it's borderline, they go to the higher thickness and it's the thickest, for example, chicken breast in the batch. As I said, and this is a great example, you can see here where they're using like a little measuring device. Different equipment's going to be used. They're going to use different equipment. That's going to require additional SOPs. So if they're going to use different types of equipment, they might need additional SOPs. And the monitoring procedure must match the validated process. They have to follow the validated process. All right, so talking about monitoring and equivalent lethality. When monitoring sous vide cooking temperatures, recording the temperature without further scientific evidence of the water bath is sufficient for monitoring procedures. True or false? All right, false. So 83% of you said false. Kind of a tricky question. False because without further scientific evidence. They could provide scientific evidence. They could support their case, but if they're just going to say, we're going to hold it in this water at this temperature and wish for the best, we want some more information. We want some more documentation to support their use of an alternate method for meeting lethality. So when you're doing that file review, if the review and the HACCP plan approval, you want to keep in mind some things here. Look at previous inspections. Are they good at what they're doing right now? Do they have a good understanding of food safety principles? You know, are you comfortable with some place taking on a special process? What documentation is available? If they're citing something in that HACCP plan, scientific documentation, records, SOPs, how are they calibrating equipment? We want to make sure we have all of that. Do they have good active managerial control? Are staff trained? Do they have a handle on things that are happening at their establishment while they're not there? So again, is active managerial control good at this establishment? You also have to think about, do they have the cooling, appropriate cooling spaces, considerations? What type of equipment are they going to use? If they're proposing using these big bins with ice slurries, are they going to have enough ice to do this? Do they have the racks in their walk-in cooler? Is the walk-in cooler going to be able to get this product down within 6 hours? So again, things that you want to consider when you are validating that HACCP plan. We rely very heavily in Wisconsin because I don't go, FYI, last year it was almost 350 variant submissions that we received. I don't have time to go to 350 places. So we rely really heavily on the inspectors in the field to help us make that determination. Remember that retail HACCP builds on the food code. So again, you're going to see, you want to make sure they're following food code, or if they're following something outside of the food code, that it's going to build, that it's going to provide the same outcome as the food code. You're going to want to look for unique hazards or processes outside of the code. Maybe if they're using FSIS Appendix A, or if they're using Appendix B for cooling, you're going to want to look for unique hazards. I am like, my head is on a swivel when I am out, when I'm lucky enough to get out in the field and do a standardization or a training or a joint inspection. And I can find things now that I probably would not have been able to find 10 years ago. Always look for those extra items that Mr. or Mrs. Operator might have in their plan. They might want to just throw some extra stuff in there. Be on the lookout for that. They cannot leave out critical items. As I promised, and there's also going to be a link in the chat as well. I know there was a question about custom processing. There is information in the AFTO HACCP plan for specialized processes at retail manual. You can digitally download it, or you can buy a lovely paper copy. There is going to be some work on some updated special processes that might not be addressed in the manual right now. You can scan the QR code, or like I said, Christina has put the link right in chat. I have the manual sitting on my desk with me at all times when I am looking at validating HACCP plans. All right, so that is all I have, and I've seen some fast and furious Q&As coming in, and my amazing team, hopefully I am confident they are getting you fantastic answers. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Tara.
Thank you, Carrie. So we are going to move on to doing field verifications. So Carrie kind of already spoke about what validation is and a little bit about the difference of field verification. But just as a reminder, the purpose of a field verification, right, is to verify that they are conducting the process as was written in the plan. So we already have that validated plan, kind of the heavy lifting, so to say, is already done. And they have this plan in place to be able to now implement that plan. So question for you is, do you currently conduct field verifications? So you can throw that in the chat. Do you conduct those now for HACCP plans? So I'm seeing yes and no, yes. I'm seeing a few no's, but I'm seeing a lot of yeses, and that's good. So the purpose of this presentation is to kind of give you some tips of things I've learned. Some of them I've learned the hard way by doing these kind of inspections for the last 10 years or so. So a quick overview of what a field verification might look like is you're going to start with a record review. So this is similar to what you would do for an inspection, right? We want to do that file review. And then sometimes you might have follow up, right, to make sure that they're maintained. Okay, oh, sorry, a little too fast there. Okay, I hear I'm breaking up. I'm gonna try just to turn my camera off just because sometimes it helps a little bit with the bandwidth. So I'm here, I'm just gonna turn my camera off and see if that helps. And I'm also skipping a little bit. So with the field verification or with the file review, if I can get back, I think I've lost control. Okay, got it back. Sorry about that. Okay, so with the file review, we are going to pay attention to a few things because oftentimes you might look at all the documents that were validated, all those documents that submitted, and they might look like this pile that you see here on the screen. And so do you have to read that entire pile? I mean, ideally, if you have the time and resources, sure, you can. But if you're like our jurisdiction, we don't often have time to read this entire pile. I'm lucky enough that I also do the reviews, so I typically know, but I tell all of our other inspectors. There's some ways or things you can focus on if you cannot read the entire plan or the entire submission. So the first thing I look at is products or menu items or ingredients that are included in there, and I kind of keep those in the back of my head. I may not be able to memorize the entire list. Sometimes I might print it out, but more often I'm looking, are there any unique things? Are there things like fish that maybe fish wouldn't normally be allowed? Looking at the process flow. So even the simplest process flow can give you some good information, right? It's going to give you all the steps in their process. It's also going to tell you where those critical control points are, hopefully, right? And it's going to tell you right away, I know if I have a critical control point, I have an associated log that I'm going to need to look for when I'm out there in the field. And then the next thing is what I call a CCP summary. It's called by a lot of different names, sometimes a HACCP worksheet. I've even seen it combined with a hazard analysis worksheet. But generically, what we're looking for is the thing that Carrie showed in her presentation, the HACCP flow. I mean, sorry, the HACCP form. And it really gives you that information about what is their critical limits, how are they monitoring, what are they monitoring, what are their required corrective actions if they need to take one, the record keeping, the verification. So it's going to give you all of that information. And that's really about 90% or more of this HACCP plan, right? So it's a really good quick view if you don't have time to read everything else. And then, of course, before we go in the field, we always want to have an idea of their previous history. So we're going to look for previous inspections, or if you do the field verification separately, some jurisdictions do. We don't. We do them with our inspections. You're going to look for previous compliance issues in the field verification or any other documentation, so you have an idea if there's some trends you need to be aware of, or if there's corrective actions you need to follow up on that maybe didn't get done. All right. So moving on to when we head to the field, I want to start talking first about verifying knowledge or training, because this is really important. If I don't have proper training in place, then that HACCP plan really isn't doing any good, right? It's basically like a paperweight and it's not doing much. So I do have a question for you that's going to hopefully pop up as a poll. And the question is, when is the best time to verify knowledge or training? Is it at the beginning of the inspection, throughout the inspection, at the end of the inspection, or maybe you just don't know and that's an okay answer as well? All right, so I'm seeing most people said throughout the inspection, and that would be my answer as well. So we want to kind of utilize our time as we're walking through and observing things to kind of ask those open-ended questions. So we're going to be observing the process. We're going to follow the described procedures or make sure they're following it. And we're going to ask those open-ended questions as we're doing it. So typically, if I'm like taking a temperature, I might say, what temperature do you look for? How do you check that? Those kind of questions. We want to avoid, if possible, those questions are like yes or no. And that's, because you often get a lot more information from the open-ended questions and you get answers that kind of lead down a different path that you wouldn't have thought of had you not posed it in an open-ended question. And then, of course, they typically will have training records that you might look at. I usually look at the training records toward the end of my inspection. I just, whichever way you want to do it, just make sure that you're not fully just relying on training records, right? Because people can document things and perhaps it's not an effective training, or maybe it was a great training, but now they forgot, right? And so we don't want to rely solely on training records, but making sure you're asking questions as you go through. All right, so I said during the file review, I kind of take a peek at product description or your menu items or your products, those kind of things. And this is an example here. So in the picture in the middle, that is foie gras. It is a USDA cured cooked foie gras, which may be allowed to be on a vacuum package plan, right? But if it's was not currently on their plan, perhaps not that big of a risk because I know it might be done safe, but we want to encourage them to utilize the plan and the things that they gave us because we don't want to see deviations that perhaps lead to riskier deviations, right? And so the salmon there might be an example. So I have to take into consideration that there's different or higher risk associated with fish and make sure that I'm addressing those risks. So the foie gras maybe not such a big deal since it's USDA cured, but then I have the salmon. So kind of keeping in mind those kind of ingredients is going to be important. Next, I'm verifying the process flow. So I'm verifying that they're doing the things in which they said it. Again, some of those deviations might be minor. They may be still safe processes, but we want to make sure that whatever deviation they had, they considered the risk for that deviation, right? And so that's what the part of the validation is about, is making sure that you considered all the risks, all the hazards that are associated with those steps, and that you're controlling them as needed. So in the middle there is the ice bath, basically, where a facility was using it. And their HACCP plan was very detailed in how much ice to product they did. So they would layer a certain number of product and then a certain amount of ice water. In this case, they weren't following their plan. They were overloading the product into the ice water, and the ice was melting and they weren't getting the cooling that they were expected. And unfortunately, they also weren't monitoring it the way they were required. So this is kind of an example of where the plan is there and designed to make sure that they can, implement safely. So if those kind of details are there, then we would want them to follow it. The picture on the right is reheating. Now, your facilities or establishments might not have this big equipment. In my jurisdiction, we have both small places and big places. Look like manufacturers, they're not manufacturers. And in this case, they were reheating this product. If this was their process flow on the left, where I'm removing from the bag before I reheat, but instead now I'm reheating in the package, that's something that they should have considered those hazards about. It's not that they couldn't add that in their plan, it's that they don't have it in their plan. All right. This is going to be super important. If you get the opportunity to watch them actually do the process, absolutely you want to verify that they are meeting those critical limits. So the photo here is a product that was being reheated in the package, and they were supposed to hit the 165 per the code. And they didn't hit the 165. As you can see by the thermometer, it says 159.6. And this is where you step in and you say, what is your corrective action? And this leans into a conversation about what is your approved corrective actions. And kind of, I always lead them back to their HACCP plan if they are telling me a corrective action, especially if it doesn't sound right, because that's a reminder that that's a resource for them. They don't have to remember it if they can know where to find it, right? They have that resource to tell them what to do. The corrective action probably or might just be throw it back in the hot water as long as it hasn't passed that 2-hour mark. I see a question that says, what's the difference between hazards and risks? And the way that I'm using it, I apologize, I'm meaning the same thing. Sorry, using a little bit of slang terminology. I hope that answered you. Okay. Next, here in this photo, we can see the data logger. So that's what they're using for their continuous electronic monitoring and refrigeration. And then we also see the unit reads 36. So both of those are consistently saying 36. Is that okay? Maybe if their plan said 41 degrees, right? But in this case, if you can kind of see the photo of the label, and you might be able to notice that they have a 30-day shelf life. So that's kind of an indicator that their HACCP plan was for 34 for 30 days. And so that now this 36 is not an acceptable temperature, and that they actually need to take a corrective action at this point. All right, so next, I'm going to talk about verifying monitoring procedures. And Carrie was talking about how their plan would have the what, the how, the frequency, and those are the kind of things you're going to want to ask questions about. Again, we don't always get the opportunity to see exactly what they're doing. I mean, in an ideal world, I'd be able to stay there and watch their entire process, but not always true. In the middle photo there, well, the first photo there, right, there's no labeling on there. So how the second bag, the bottom bag has a slight label. You can't really see it. It's not got the date labels on it. And so in that case, how are we monitoring for that shelf life? Like, where is that? The middle photo there, they're taking the water temperature, and maybe that's okay if that's in their validated plan with the science that says this water temperature results in this product final temperature. But in this case, that was supposed to be an internal temperature, so that's not going to be adequate, right? I don't know if that heats a middle or an internal temperature for that food. And then the last photo there is just kind of showing what they were supposed to be doing, which is using that thermocouple tape, sometimes called sous vide tape, where they're probing in. And again, just a reminder, this is not the only way that you can monitor these things. There are alternatives, as Carrie pointed out, but at this point, we just want to make sure they're following what's in their HACCP plan. If they want to change to that alternative scientific methods, that's something they need to resubmit, update their HACCP plan to get that validated. All right. So next, now when we see those kind of issues with critical limits, we're going to ask what is the immediate corrective action we need to take. So this is a question for you. During a verification of a cook chill facility, you observe product being packaged at a temperature below the required temperature. What corrective action should be taken? You're going to remove the product from ROP and do not package? Are you going to reheat the product and restart the packaging process? Are you going to discard the batch or take the action detailed in the HACCP plan? All right, so I'm seeing a variety of answers, but most people, 69%, are saying take the action detailed in the HACCP plan. And so that is really the correct answer. If the HACCP plan details a corrective action, it's not that those other corrective actions might not work, but this is their plan, right? This is what they decided was going to be the corrective action they would take. So sometimes there's options for corrective action, and I've even seen plans that write those options in. They say that I'll do this under this circumstance, and I'll do this under this circumstance. But again, really that HACCP plan is a resource for them, and they should really be following those things. All right, and sometimes when we get the immediate corrective action taken care of, we want to make sure that they are consistent, right? So we're getting that long-term corrective action. This chart here is not from my jurisdiction. Veronica Bryant, who's been so nice to help us answer questions today, actually gave me this chart. And I really like it because it gives an example of a long-term corrective action policy that you could utilize that is based on the risk of what you're seeing, right? So if we're talking about those critical limits, that's going to be super important, and we're going to come back a little quicker, right? We take the immediate corrective action, but we want to make sure you're consistently doing that. If you're talking about other areas of non-compliance, maybe you can have a little more freedom to come back a little bit later. Maybe that's not going to be quite as critical as the critical limits. If you don't have any policies in place, I would recommend that you talk to management. Hopefully they'll get those policies in place for you, but if not, at least get some ideas of what they would want to see, what is an appropriate long-term corrective action here. If I had to take an immediate corrective action, when should you go back? And having that kind of answer ahead of time is really going to help you, plan ahead. Something else to be considered and talk to your management about if you haven't already have a policy in place is when or if the HACCP plan approval should be revoked. In my jurisdiction, we have a 3-strike kind of policy, and this is for major non-compliance issues. So the first time we see it, of course, we take that immediate corrective action. We are going to take that long-term corrective action. But on top of that, we document that this is your first official warning of non-compliance with your HACCP plan, and that further non-compliance could lead to revocation of the HACCP approval. The second issue that we see, major issue, we bring them in for a supervisory. Our supervisor would then talk to them and try to come up with a plan of how do we get that long-term corrective action so that we're not constantly having to go in and find the same issues. And so they would, sometimes that means update your HACCP plan to make it more realistic to what you're actually doing on site. And sometimes it just means I need to do more training or something like that to make sure that they're getting that long-term corrective action. And then for our 3rd strike or our last time, that does result in a potential HACCP or revocation of the HACCP approval. That might be for a temporary revocation until they meet certain conditions, or it might be a long-term revocation. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about record keeping. Sometimes we go into these establishments and the records are really the only indicator that they're following these plans. If you didn't get, the right timing and you're in there and they're not actually doing that process, because, for us, it's unannounced. So if you're in there and you aren't actually seeing all the steps in the process, the records are really your indicator of whether they're following that. And so just again, a little reminder, you might have records or you will have records associated with critical control points. If they've identified a critical control point, then they should be monitoring those critical limits and documenting them. As Carrie pointed out, they should have records for corrective actions. And sometimes you'll have records for prerequisites like thermometer calibration as a common one for HACCP, for ROP HACCP plans. So you're going to defer to what's in their HACCP plan and approval. And I kind of mentioned that I always kind of take a peek at those logs before I head out. The reason I do that is not for formatting. Honestly, if they change formats, it's not a big deal to us. But if sometimes, more often than I'd like, we see that they change them to meet their establishment's needs, but they leave off content. And then because there's no place to document that, they, because they don't have space to document, then they're not actually documenting the things that they need to do for their plan. So we always like to see a space on those records dedicated to what they're saying they're going to document. All right. So here are a little bit of examples. So I'm going to look, when I look at the records, I typically do this when I sit down, right? When I sit down to go get ready to write my report, I'll say, give me records. I take photos as I'm in the inspection or in the field verification of products. And so you'll want to look at a minimum of 3 batches or products. And sometimes you'll be able to look in the actual like refrigeration and take pictures of labels on products if it's like cooked, chill, or sous vide, and that can give you an indicator to follow the process for that food. But when I'm looking at 3 batches, I'm looking, or 3 products for the record review, I want to look for something that's pretty recent, something current, like, you know, today or yesterday. I want to look for something maybe a couple of weeks out if possible. And I want to look for things that are a little further out, because that tells me if they're maintaining their records as required by their plan for like the 6 months or whatever they put in their plan. Okay, so somebody already pointed out how nice that continuous monitoring on the side looks. This was a place that kind of had a fancy system that was monitoring their cooking with this record, right? So this is a dial wheel that spins and it takes the temperature as it goes. And so when you see that, it's supposed to be 1 wheel per batch of product, but they weren't removing the wheel. And so they were just letting it run for months. And so when I come in, this is an opportunity for me to have a conversation with that person in charge and say, you know, how do you verify this? If you're looking at the logs, how do you know that they hit these cooking temperatures, right? It takes them back to, we're not on site all the time. This is their HACCP plan. As much as we like having that guide, it is it is really their plan. And so we're hoping that we can partner with that person in charge, and that person in charge is actually making sure that these things are being implemented daily, right? And so that's where I have the conversation. How are you verifying? On the right, that is a refrigeration log. You can't really see it, but the rows are, each row is a date. And then they go across and they write the temperature of the unit, the time, and then Dixon is a type of continuous electronic monitoring. For their plan, they write down what that continuous electronic monitoring reads. And you can kind of see, without even knowing the dates on there, you can see the gaps, right? So again, this is a conversation. And this is where I would have the conversation as, what are you looking for when you verify? And also, what do you do when you find gaps? I don't want you to go back and write a temperature that's made up from, 3 days ago or whatever. I want to see, I want to see a corrective action written if you had a small gap. And in that corrective action, or a note that says, hey, I retrained, right? I can't go back in time and know what that temperature was, but I can at least document that I addressed it. Yep. Okay, and the next we're going to look for, are the records accurate and realistic, right? Somebody just mentioned pistol whipping in the chat, and this might be a good example of that. So on this log, you can see that these products cooled from their cooking temperatures all the way to below 41 in somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes. Is that realistic with their equipment? Is that going to be able to, can they realistically do that, right? And so again, this is a conversation with the person in charge. It looks nice, maybe you filled it out, it might look perfect. And sometimes facilities, they want perfection, right? They want this to look like it's great and perfect, and the better it looks, the better. Unfortunately, that's not accurate, and these logs aren't any good if they're not accurate. It's okay to have problems on your logs. That shows us you're monitoring, right? It's okay to write a corrective action. And sometimes we have to remind people of that. All right. So this is another continuous electronic monitoring unit. This one is for a refrigeration unit, and this is kind of to point out, is the information accurate? So it's a little bit blurred behind, but you can see the 32.9 hopefully in the digital readout. And then the temperature is reading 10 degrees. So on the surface, below the 34 they needed, that's great, right? So I take this wheel off once a week and I file it. I no longer see that digital readout. So if nobody's paying attention to what it's actually reading on the continuous electronic monitoring, we might have a problem, because this is reading 10 degrees. And maybe it's okay because it's really 32, but what if the real temperature was, 45 or something and it's reading too low? So this is something where I would talk to them about making sure that what's being written on that log, in this case, where you can see it, is accurate. All right. And the last thing I want to kind of mention is that we don't want to, be so hyper-focused on the HACCP requirements and the CCPs that we miss out on all the others. Of course, that is our priority and our focus, to make sure those critical control points and those critical limits are being met. But also, don't put your blinders on. So this photo is not maybe the best, but if you look under the label maker, you can see where they're storing their bags. And in this case was not a problem, but maybe that's something you want to address or look at if it's not in a place that can be contamination free. So even besides the calibration of equipment records that you might see, like, are you seeing basic food safety, good practices? Because if I don't have good practices in place, this is really going to impact whether or not my HACCP or my food can be safe. I can do all the critical control points absolutely great, but if I didn't base it on a good foundation of food safety, then I could still have a problem. All right, and with that, I think we are at the question section. So if we have any questions, anybody want for me, Tom, or Carrie, you want to raise your hand, we'd be happy to help you if we can. I don't know if I can see the hands. So if somebody sees hands and I'm missing it, please let me know.
I see hands. Zach, your hand is up. Did you have a question? Zach Nugel. Nope. All right. Then we have.
Hold on, Carrie. I need to unmute them and then tell them to unmute themselves. So Zach, I have unmuted you. You should be able to unmute yourself and ask a question.
I am not hearing anything. All right.
Who do you want to move on to next?
Yeah, so I think CUN 66782.
All right, I am going to allow you to talk. You will have to unmute yourself and then you should be able to ask your question.
And I know, Amy, I think their hands had been up for a while, so I'm not wondering if they accidentally put them up.
Okay, do you want me to lower all hands and then whoever has another question can raise their hands again?
Otherwise, is it Yvette Parks? Do you have a question? And I believe you can now unmute yourself. Everybody was all excited, raising hands, and nobody's got questions for us. Let's see if there's anything.
Hey, Amy, I would lower all the hands and then let anyone that actually is present and ready. And then Matthew might also have some. You guys were rock stars answering these questions as they came on, but Matthew might have captured something additionally. I'm not really sure.
All right, everyone's
Yes,
hands unraised. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll wait for the hands to be raised as Matthew asks the questions.
Yeah, and I also have was able to capture a few questions and go through. There was two questions that came up about custom processing. There was two that, and I know that's something that comes up when we're doing inspections in the field, especially with special processes and HACCP. If anybody would like to comment on, one of the questions was, do you know where I could find template for that type of HACCP plan for custom processing. And in the presentation, I think this was with Tom, I believe, what kind of custom processing is being referred to? Is there a USDA inspected or exempt process for that?
The custom processing we're talking about when we discuss it as a special process at retail it's not like an exempt meat or a meat that's inspected under an alternative USDA inspection program. Those are allowed. They still shouldn't be like probably slaughtering and butchering animals at retail, but certainly retail establishments cut up large portions of various types of various species of meat, and that's acceptable. This would be for animals that were harvested from the wild or perhaps raised on a family farm that are not USDA inspected or do not meet one of the approved programs. So retailers will often butcher animals and charge a fee for this service, but that would require a variance, and for sure. And I think the other question asked, is there a template somewhere that could help a regulatory agency determine what should be controlled in those circumstances? And if they want to shoot me an email, I can dig something up for them, unless one of the other panelists know where they can find one. We certainly have one that we teach in our special processes class, FDA special processes class, which is, I help teach it, but I forget if that's AFTA or NEHA. But we definitely have some templates out there. I'd be happy to get whoever is asking that question, get one in their hands if they send me an email. I don't think there's one on the AFTA website, is there? Or is it part of the manual that was put together? Do you know?
There's no templates in there. There's a little bit of information. Carrie and I were talking a little bit behind the scenes. There's a little bit of information in, but there was no template that I could find. Carrie, you can tell me if you found something, but no.
There's not, and like Tom said, we do have a unit in FD 312 on custom processing. So I am going to tell you, and I know I put this in the Q&A as well. In Wisconsin, we have a lot of custom processing. We do things a little differently. We require a variance, and we require some SOPs, SSOPs, how they're storing it. It's labeled not for sale. They're cleaning and sanitizing equipment like they should for the food code in between species anyway, based on hierarchy of cook temperatures. You really want to look at, I would say there's probably 5 critical control points in that process. And then again, I want to say that you want to verify with your agency who does the meat inspection programs. There might be some things that they require as well when it comes to what actually is the definition of custom processing in your jurisdiction. So we do not allow the custom processing of amenable species under a retail license. They have to get a meat bureau license. When we talk custom processing, we're talking game animals, we're talking venison, we're talking turkey, wild turkey, we're talking maybe wild boar, elk, things like that. So if you want to reach out to one of us, we might be able to help you. And John did put in there is a section on custom processing with an example scenario, just not a HACCP template. And I'm going to put my email in the chat as well. And Autumn, correct me if I'm wrong, can our attendees save the chat?
They cannot. I have the chat, but you probably won't want the thousands of chats.
No, so we're going to
we're going to post the question and answers and pulling some of the chat questions and answers into a document, and it'll be posted on the event page in the coming days. Yep. So anything of relevance will be there. Your presentations will be there, which will have your contact information as well.
Yes, I was just going to say, our biographies and our contact information is attached to the Bootcamp as well. So,
yep, go to that event page. It's all right there for your viewing pleasure. There are a few questions in Q&A. If any of you want to stab at one, or they're kind of all over the map, but if we don't get to them, we just have a few, we have some more extra time because you all were so great with delivering very efficiently. So yeah, definitely take the time to answer them if you will, or we could give people back some time.
We do have some hand raised again, if we want to try that again.
That's great.
So I do see the question right here where it's asking about continuous temperature monitoring required for only cook chill HACCP. So cook chill and sous vide, the code does say continuous electronic monitoring is required. It doesn't actually specify for anything else. That doesn't mean that somebody might not have it in their HACCP plan, but the code doesn't actually say it that you have to have it for anything but the cook chill and sous vide.
And I just point out though, that's only if a variance isn't required and they're following everything else.
Right.
In accordance with 350212. So if they want to stray from that at all, they need to submit a variance request, and then the regulatory authority can require anything that they want. You're right. In that particular instance, it's only cook, chill, and sous vide, and the reason for that is that that's the sole barrier to pathogenic bacterial growth and toxin formation. So it's super critical at that point.
I see a comment about asking about checking calibration of a fixed thermocouple probe in a cooler. I'm guessing you mean like that continuous electronic monitoring is my guess. So typically that's done. So the specific picture, if you're talking about the specific picture I showed in that scenario, in that particular unit, that probe kind of gets bumped, unfortunately, kind of easily when they're taking the paper on and off. It is just how they set the probe on there. But typically in-house, they're just verifying those thermometers right there. They're going to have a technician that's actually, maybe it's a yearly or twice, whatever their manufacturer says. Typically, it's not being calibrated and adjusted for most of those. It's actually just being verified that those are accurate using a secondary thermometer. And if anybody else on the panel has more to say about that.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely with you, Tara. That's typically what we look for in the manufacturing world anyway. And I recommend the same at retail. The code is kind of silent about how those visual checks occur twice daily. In seafood HACCP, there's similar language for lots of products, for lots of processes, excuse me. Typically what we would look for in that instance is like a NIST traceable thermometer that can be compared to the recording thermometer, so that that thermometer you're checking the recording device with is accurate, because it comes with a certificate that guarantees its accuracy for X amount of time. So that's, to me, I think that's like the best practice for verifying the continuous monitoring devices using this traceable. Make a record that record both temperatures, and when you get the NIST thermometer, and the one that's recording temperatures. Not that the code says it's got to be recorded, it just says continuously monitored, but not to drag us down another rabbit hole, but that's the best case scenario.
And we have a kind of going on that with thermometers. There was a question, there was two separate questions, but they kind of joined together a little bit. If cooking raw chicken breasts using sous vide, how would you know when it reaches that 165 or the proper temperature? And then also indicating immediately, food must be immediately sous vide after being placed in ROP. By immediate, would you say, what would that time frame be, or what would you refer to as immediate? So those two-part question.
Immediate means you bag the food and it goes into the water bath. Technically, now obviously there can be a little bit of a delay. I believe, and I'd have to look it up, there's some scientific data that shows that you can actually get CBOT growth and toxin formation above 70 degrees Fahrenheit in 2 hours or less, which is why I believe we use that language immediately. So I think if they're within that 2-hour window, if I had to take a corrective action, if they didn't do it immediately, I might let it go up to that 2-hour window, but not beyond that. But really, they should be prepared to cook the food after, shortly after it goes in the bags. And again, we're talking raw food that has lots of competing organisms, but not to go off on a tangent, there are additional hurdles there if you're talking raw chicken. And then what was your first question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, it was related to the thermometers. Y'all were talking about thermometers, but someone had asked about the question. I had a question about using thermometers to determine proper cook temperature when using sous vide. What would be the best way to check to make sure that that food reached proper temperature using thermometers in the sous vide process?
Do you want me to answer this, or you guys want to? You're muted, Tara.
Sorry, thank you. You know, it's gonna be dictated by their plan. So I think Tom showed a little bit of, you know, he showed the thermocouple tape, I believe, in his presentation. It was also a picture in mine. I call it thermocouple tape. It goes by sous vide. It goes by different names. Carrie kind of mentioned there's some other ways that you can potentially validate that you're hitting that cooking temperature without actually probing into the food. We also see some times where they will what we call sacrifice a bag. And that doesn't mean sacrifice the food. It just means I have to probe through a bag without any kind of tape or anything that keeps it from sealing or seals it back up. And in that case, maybe now I have to open the bag and utilize that piece for something else because it's now compromised the packaging on it by probing through it. So that's something we often see as well in HACCP plans. But again, it's really going to depend on what they say. And there might be things I'm not talking about that they've provided science for that said this is a validated way to make sure that that thing hits it. So I don't want to say those are the only things. And if you're not familiar with the sous vide tape or the thermocouple tape that I'm talking about, what it does, if you have a thin enough probe and you probe through the tape, you can probe through the tape through the bag, pull the probe back out, and it seals it back up. So it does not compromise the packaging at that point because it basically seals it back. Looks a little bit like weather stripping for a door.
Good way to put it. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that's all the time we have for questions, and definitely want to thank our panel for their presentations and the information you provided. A lot of great information that I know our attendees are going to take back with them to their jurisdictions and apply as they do their inspections and in the field. So thank you all very much. We greatly appreciate that. And I will turn back over to Autumn.
Very good. I don't know about you all, but that was amazing. I mean, all the questions being answered. I think you all need a nap now because it's a lot. So thank you so much. And it just goes to show that even though this has been a repeated presentation, there's still a lot of questions left to be answered. So thank you guys for spending time with us and always being willing to help share your knowledge. And all the people behind the scenes too, because it's, you know, not just the people on the screen that are doing it, but some people helping behind the scenes too. So all right, so I want to close this out. These are the objectives that we had out for today, and I think they hit it out of the park. And so I hope that you all feel that you have gained more knowledge today and that you're smarter than when you got here. That's the goal. And if you want to flip to the next slide, I should have these all memorized by now, but I don't. So the evaluation is important to us because although we do repeat information from year to year because we want to make sure people get the same stuff because it's great information, we are willing to shift to those things that people feel they need that they're not getting. So please let us know, join us in additional boot camps as well, but let us know. The evaluation link has been put into the chat and Christina keeps dropping it as the chat blows up. There is an event page, which is where you would have gone to register for today. So it's afdo.org/bootcamp. Choose the session we're on, and we're going to be posting the presentations and the Q&A, which I'm still gathering links and trying to do all of that so that you'll have information to reference. Everyone gets a certificate of attendance, whether or not you want it or not, because it's just easier that way. And the recording will be shared by the end of the month. This recording is not for everyone. So you guys are lucky. You get it because you were here. So if you missed a part of it or you're like, man, I really like to hear Carrie talk,
And so you want to go back over Carrie's part. She gives a bad face. Then you can go back and review it. And so if you have attended at all today, you'll get a recording link at the end of the month once all sessions are complete. So if you would flip to the next slide, it'll show our work group. These people have been great. Matthew is listed here, right? So he was our moderator for today. Thank you, Matthew, for helping us work through the different speakers and the questions that came up. Super great job. He's also a part of this work group. So I love that a lot of them come and attend, although they've been on many of the sessions in the past. So this is my group. And the last slide is just showing the funding that we get to put this on every year. So we really appreciate the FDA helping us fund this event that covers thousands of people every year, which is quite amazing. Very awesome. So thank you all for being here, and I hope to see you in the future. Thanks, everyone.
long-term corrective action.
Thanks, Tara.
Thank you. Bye.
Do I have a post meeting or?
No, we're good. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
much.